The Carboniferous world was not a prelude to dinosaurs. It was not a simple stepping stone toward the familiar age of reptiles. It was a fully realized planet in its own right, operating under rules that no longer exist. If a modern human were placed into this world without protection, without technology, survival would not be measured in days or even hours. It would be measured in minutes. The Carboniferous period began roughly 359 million years ago and lasted for nearly 60 million years. This was a time when Earth looked stable from space. Yet, on the surface, it was profoundly hostile to anything shaped by modern evolution. Continents were slowly drifting toward one another, assembling into the early stages of Pangea. Vast equatorial regions were locked in perpetual warmth and moisture. There were no ice caps at the poles during much of this era, and sea levels were high. But the real danger was not temperature or geography. It was the air itself. Oxygen levels during the late Carboniferous reached approximately 30 to 35%, compared to just 21% today. To the untrained mind, more oxygen may sound like an advantage. In reality, it would fundamentally disrupt how the human body functions. Oxygen at that concentration becomes toxic over extended exposure. It increases oxidative stress in cells, accelerates tissue damage, and heightens the risk of seizures and respiratory failure. Breathing would feel sharp, almost electric. Every breath would overstimulate the nervous system. The lungs, adapted for a lower oxygen world, would struggle to regulate gas exchange. Dizziness would arrive quickly. Confusion would follow. But the atmosphere was only the beginning. The Carboniferous Earth was dominated by forests so dense and expansive that they reshaped the global climate. These were not forests of oak, pine, or palm. They were composed of giant lycopsids, towering club mosses that reached heights of over 30 meters. Their trunks were covered in scale, like patterns rather than bark. Horsetails grew as thick as trees. Ferns formed layered walls of vegetation that blocked sunlight almost entirely from the forest floor. The canopy was so dense that midday could resemble twilight. Underfoot, the ground was unstable. These forests grew in vast swamp systems, fed by slow-moving rivers and constant rainfall. Soil was saturated, often floating atop thick layers of decaying plant matter. A single misstep could plunge a person into mud so deep and dense that escape would be impossible without assistance. There were no solid trails, no clearings, no dry ground to retreat to. Every movement would require effort, balance, and constant vigilance. And yet, the most immediate psychological shock would be the silence that feels wrong. There were no birds, no mammals, no familiar calls or rhythms. Instead, the air was filled with the subtle crackling of insects, the slow creaking of plant matter, and the distant splashes of amphibians slipping through dark water. Sound did not travel cleanly in this environment. Humidity thickened the air. Dense vegetation absorbed echoes. Orientation became difficult. Humans rely heavily on auditory cues to navigate unfamiliar spaces. Here, those cues would be distorted or absent. Within minutes, the realization would set in that nothing in this world recognizes you. The Carboniferous was ruled by arthropods. Insects and their relatives thrived under high oxygen conditions, growing to sizes that are impossible today. Dragonflies, with wingspans exceeding 70 centimeters, patrolled the air. Millipede-like creatures stretched several meters long across the forest floor. Spiders and scorpions grew heavy, armored, and efficient. They were not aggressive in the human sense, but they were dominant, and they responded to movement, vibration, and heat. A human body would be an anomaly. Warm, loud, constantly moving. Every step through leaf litter would send vibrations through the ground. Every exhalation would release carbon dioxide in an atmosphere where gas pockets already pooled near the surface. Predators would not need to recognize you as prey. Curiosity alone could be fatal, but even without a single animal encounter, survival would still fail. The humidity of the Carboniferous forests was relentless. Sweat could not evaporate efficiently, trapping heat against the skin. Core body temperature would begin to rise. Dehydration would accelerate despite the presence of water everywhere, because most surface water was stagnant, low in oxygen, and filled with microorganisms incompatible with the human immune system. Drinking it would introduce pathogens the body has no evolutionary defense against. Refusing to drink would lead to rapid dehydration in a high-oxygen, high-temperature environment. Meanwhile, fungal life dominated decay. Massive fungi broke down fallen trees and plant matter, releasing spores in astronomical quantities. Every breath would draw these spores deep into the lungs. Inflammation would begin quickly. Airways would swell. Coughing would intensify. Breathing would become laborious, not because oxygen was scarce, but because the lungs were overwhelmed. Vision would degrade as well. Low-light conditions beneath the canopy would strain human eyes, adapted to open skies. Depth perception would falter. Shapes would blur into layers of green and shadow. Movement would be misinterpreted. Panic would rise as the brain struggled to make sense of unfamiliar sensory input. And panic, in this environment, is lethal. Heart rate would increase, driving even more oxygen into already overstimulated tissues. Muscles would fatigue faster. Coordination would decline. The risk of slipping, falling, or becoming trapped would increase exponentially. A twisted ankle or minor injury would immediately become life-threatening. There was no dry ground to rest on. No clean surface to treat wounds. Infection would begin almost immediately. Time would feel distorted. Without clear landmarks or sunlight patterns, the brain would lose track of hours. The forest did not change for human convenience. There was no dusk signaling safety, no nightfall bringing quiet. Danger remained constant, ambient, and indifferent. The Carboniferous world was not violent in the way modern disaster scenarios are imagined. There were no earthquakes shaking the ground beneath your feet, no volcanoes erupting nearby. Instead, it was quietly, systematically incompatible with human existence. Every element of the environment worked against the biological assumptions hard-coded into the human body. We evolved in a world with birds as early warning systems, mammals as ecological peers, and oxygen levels that support endurance without toxicity. We evolved with dry land to retreat to predictable day-night cycles and microbial environments we could gradually adapt to. None of those conditions existed here. This was a world optimized for plants that never stopped growing, for insects that never needed to shrink, and for ecosystems that stored carbon instead of releasing it. It was a world that would eventually collapse under its own excess, paving the way for new forms of life, and ultimately, for us. But standing inside it, alone, unprotected, and unfamiliar, that future would mean nothing. You would not survive a day in the Carboniferous forests because this planet was not built for you. It was built for giants that breathed differently, moved differently, and belonged to a version of Earth that no longer exists. And this was only the beginning. The Carboniferous forests did not merely exist on the planet, they controlled it. Plants were no longer passive background life, waiting for animals to shape the world. During this period, vegetation became the dominant force on Earth, rewriting atmospheric chemistry, climate systems, and even the rules of survival themselves. To understand why a human would fail so quickly here, you must understand that these forests were not ecosystems in balance, they were ecosystems in excess. The land was locked in a near constant greenhouse state. Equatorial regions received heavy rainfall year-round. Temperatures remained warm with little seasonal variation. Under these conditions, plant growth accelerated beyond anything seen before or since. Trees did not compete politely for space. They expanded relentlessly, upward and outward, stacking layers of biomass upon layers of decay. These forests were so productive that they removed enormous amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through photosynthesis. Plants converted carbon dioxide into oxygen at an unprecedented rate. Over millions of years, this process pushed oxygen levels higher and higher, reshaping the chemistry of the air itself. This was not a gentle transition, it was a planetary imbalance. For plants, this oxygen-rich environment was ideal. Higher oxygen meant faster metabolism, more efficient energy use, and accelerated growth cycles. Spores spread farther. Roots expanded deeper into waterlogged ground. Entire continents were transformed into endless swamp forests, stretching from horizon to horizon. For humans, this same environment would feel hostile from the first breath. Oxygen toxicity is not immediate, but in an environment saturated with moisture and biological contaminants, its effects would compound rapidly. Inflammation would begin in the lungs as delicate tissues struggled to regulate gas exchange. Blood chemistry would shift. Oxidative damage would increase at the cellular level. Fatigue would arrive far earlier than expected, even without physical exertion. But the forest would not allow rest. The structure of Carboniferous vegetation created an almost claustrophobic environment. Trunks rose straight and narrow, packed tightly together. There were few open spaces, no meadows, no clearings. Fallen trees did not dry out and decompose quickly. Instead, they sank into the swamp, layering atop older debris, forming unstable platforms that could collapse under weight. Movement through this forest was not a matter of walking forward. It was a constant negotiation with the terrain. Every step risked sinking. Every attempt to climb over debris risked slipping into water thick with decay. And that water was not benign. Carboniferous swamps were low in dissolved oxygen despite the oxygen-rich air above them. Microbial life thrived in these stagnant pools, breaking down organic matter and releasing gases like methane and hydrogen sulfide. These gases accumulated near the surface, especially in still air beneath the canopy. Pockets of invisible, odorless suffocation zones formed unpredictably. A human stepping into one of these pockets would feel lightheaded within seconds. Breathing would become labored. Muscles would weaken. Collapse could follow before the danger was even recognized. Above, the plants continued their quiet domination. Leaves were not shaped for beauty or efficiency by human standards. Many were large, fibrous, and coated in waxy surfaces that repelled water. Rain did not gently fall through the canopy. It pooled, dripped, and poured in sudden cascades. Humidity remained near saturation at all times. Clothing would become heavy and soaked almost immediately. Skin would soften, increasing vulnerability to cuts, infections, and fungal growth. The human body depends on evaporation to regulate temperature. Here, evaporation barely functioned. Heat built up internally. Sweat offered little relief. Exhaustion became inevitable. And yet, heat was not the only threat imposed by plants. The Carboniferous forests were chemically aggressive. Many plants released defensive compounds into the environment, not aimed at mammals, but at insects, fungi, and competing vegetation. These compounds, accumulated in soil and water, contact with skin, could cause irritation or allergic reactions. Ingestion would lead to severe gastrointestinal distress. Finding safe food was impossible. There were no fruits, no seeds recognizable to humans. Edible plant structures, as we know them, had not evolved. Most plants reproduced via spores, not nutrient-rich fruiting bodies. Even if something appeared edible, it would likely be indigestible, toxic, or both. Hunger would not kill you in a day, but weakness from lack of calories would accelerate every other failure. The psychological toll of this environment cannot be overstated. Humans evolved in landscapes with depth and variation. Open skies, distant horizons, and predictable landmarks anchor our sense of space. The Carboniferous forests erased those anchors completely. Visibility was limited to a few meters in most directions. Everything looked similar. Orientation failed quickly. Without the sun visible overhead, the brain lost its primary reference point. Time itself became ambiguous. Minutes felt longer. Decision-making slowed. Stress hormones flooded the body, impairing rational thought. Small problems felt insurmountable. The urge to flee conflicted with the impossibility of escape, and escape was impossible. These forests stretched across entire continents. There was no edge to reach, no river to follow that guaranteed safety. Even waterways were dangerous, choked with vegetation and inhabited by large amphibians adapted to ambush prey in murky water. The plants did not care. They continued to grow, to shed, to decay, to recycle carbon endlessly. Their success would eventually bury vast quantities of organic material under sediment, locking carbon away as coal. This process would slowly reduce atmospheric oxygen and bring the age of giants to an end. But in the moment, standing among them, there was no sign of collapse, only abundance. Overwhelming, suffocating abundance. The Carboniferous forests demonstrate a fundamental truth about life on Earth. Dominance does not require intelligence. It does not require awareness. It requires conditions that favor replication above all else. Plants found those conditions here, and they exploited them completely. Humans, arriving millions of years too late, would be nothing more than a biological mismatch. A warm-blooded organism evolved for balance, dropped into a world defined by excess. You would not be attacked immediately. You would not be torn apart or hunted down. Instead, the forest would quietly dismantle you, breath by breath, step by step, cell by cell. This was a planet ruled by plants, and there was no room left for you. Oxygen is often described as the foundation of complex life, the invisible fuel that powers every movement, every thought, every heartbeat. In the Carboniferous period, there was more of it than the planet had ever seen before or would ever see again, and that abundance would be one of the fastest ways a modern human would die. During the late Carboniferous, atmospheric oxygen levels climbed to roughly 30 to 35%. This increase was not gradual on human timescales, but over millions of years it transformed how life functioned. Insects grew larger because oxygen could diffuse more efficiently through their bodies. Fires burned hotter and faster. Metabolism accelerated across entire ecosystems. But the human body, evolved in a far leaner atmosphere, would experience this surplus as a physiological assault. From the first breath, something would feel wrong. Breathing would feel unusually easy at first. Oxygen would flood the lungs with every inhale. Blood oxygen saturation would spike rapidly. The body, trained to interpret high oxygen levels as a sign of exertion or stress, would respond by increasing heart rate and respiration. This feedback loop would push even more oxygen into tissues already receiving too much. Within minutes, oxidative stress would begin to rise. Oxygen is reactive by nature. In excess, it damages proteins, lipids, and DNA. Cells possess antioxidant systems to manage this, but those systems evolved for 21% oxygen, not 35%. Free radicals would accumulate faster than the body could neutralize them. The nervous system would be among the first to suffer. High oxygen levels increase neuronal excitability. The brain becomes more sensitive, more reactive, and less stable. Symptoms would begin subtly. Lightheadedness, a faint ringing in the ears, a sense of pressure behind the eyes. Then confusion, difficulty focusing, slowed reaction time paired with heightened anxiety. Coordination would degrade. Fine motor control would falter. Walking across uneven ground would become increasingly difficult. A stumble that might be harmless in a modern environment could become catastrophic in a swamp where falling means immersion in contaminated water. As exposure continued, the risk of oxygen-induced seizures would rise dramatically. Hyperoxia can trigger uncontrolled electrical activity in the brain, leading to convulsions without warning. A seizure in the Carboniferous forest would not be survivable. Loss of consciousness, even briefly, would leave the body vulnerable to drowning, suffocation, or injury. But the lungs would suffer just as severely. Prolonged exposure to high oxygen damages the alveoli, the tiny air sacs where gas exchange occurs. Inflammation would thicken their membranes, reducing efficiency. Paradoxically, breathing would become more difficult over time, despite the abundance of oxygen. Coughing would begin, chest tightness would follow, breathing would feel shallow and labored. Add humidity to this equation, and the situation worsens. Carboniferous air was saturated with moisture. Water vapor reduces the efficiency of heat dissipation and exacerbates respiratory irritation. Inhaled spores, microbial fragments, and plant particles would cling to inflamed lung tissue. Immune responses would trigger swelling, further narrowing airways. The sensation would not be one of suffocation from lack of oxygen, but of drowning in too much of it. Meanwhile, the cardiovascular system would be under immense strain. Elevated oxygen levels cause blood vessels to constrict in certain regions, particularly in the brain and lungs. Blood pressure would fluctuate unpredictably. The heart would work harder to maintain circulation, increasing the risk of arrhythmias. Fatigue would arrive far earlier than expected. Muscles overloaded with oxygen would generate energy inefficiently under these abnormal conditions. Lactic acid buildup would occur despite low exertion. Weakness would spread through the limbs. And then there was fire. In a 35% oxygen atmosphere, combustion behaves very differently. Materials that smolder today would ignite instantly. Damp plant matter could burn. A single spark from friction, a lightning strike, or even static discharge could trigger a firestorm. Humans carry ignition sources without realizing it. Metal striking stone. Rapid movement through dry foliage. Even clothing fibers rubbing together. In a carboniferous forest, these minor interactions could be lethal. Fires would spread rapidly along the forest floor, climbing trunks and racing through the canopy with explosive speed. Escape would be impossible. Smoke inhalation would be immediate and overwhelming. In an oxygen-rich environment, smoke contains higher concentrations of toxic combustion products, accelerating respiratory failure. But even without fire, oxygen altered how time itself felt inside the body. High oxygen exposure disrupts circadian rhythms. Sleep becomes shallow or impossible. The brain remains in a state of heightened alert, unable to power down. Exhaustion accumulates rapidly. Decision-making degrades. Panic becomes more likely. Humans depend on periods of rest to recover from stress. The Carboniferous environment denied that recovery at every level: chemical, physiological, psychological, and there was no adaptation window. Evolution works across generations, not ours. There would be no gradual acclimatization, no adjustment period where the body slowly recalibrates. Damage would accumulate faster than repair could occur. This is why the idea that more oxygen means greater survival is a dangerous misconception. Oxygen is essential, but only within a narrow range. Beyond that range, it becomes toxic. Life on Earth exists because of balance, not abundance. The Carboniferous period represents a rare moment when that balance tipped dramatically in one direction. Plants flourished, insects grew colossal, fire reshaped landscapes. But mammals, had they existed, would have struggled immensely. A human dropped into this world would experience oxygen not as a life-giver, but as a slow poison. Every breath would push the body closer to failure. Every heartbeat would accelerate the damage. By the time the forest itself became the primary threat, the body would already be compromised. Reactions slowed, strength diminished, perception distorted. You would not collapse instantly. You would deteriorate, and that deterioration would be relentless. Oxygen overload was not just an environmental detail of the Carboniferous. It was the invisible force that made survival impossible. A silent pressure in the air, pushing the human body beyond the limits it was ever meant to endure. In this world, even breathing was dangerous. The trees of the Carboniferous forests were not trees as the modern world understands them. They were something older, stranger, and far less forgiving. Their shapes, chemistry, and life cycles followed rules that no longer apply to any forest on Earth today. Standing among them, a human would not feel sheltered. They would feel surrounded by structures that were alive, massive, and utterly indifferent. The dominant giants of this era were lycopsids. These were not woody trees built from dense, supportive tissue like oak or pine. Instead, they were essentially enormous club mosses, scaling upward on hollow trunks reinforced by pressurized water rather than solid wood. Some reached heights of 30 to 40 meters, with trunks that rose straight and narrow before exploding into crowns of stiff, radiating leaves. Their surfaces were covered in diamond-shaped scars, remnants of fallen leaves that once carried spores. These scars were not decorative. They were functional, channels for gas exchange and structural support. Touching them would feel rough, fibrous, and brittle. These trees did not age gracefully. When modern trees die, they harden, dry, and gradually collapse. Carboniferous trees behave differently. Once a lycopsid died, it often remained standing, hollowed and weakened from the inside. Entire forests were filled with dead trunks that looked alive but were structurally unstable. A light impact or shift in the saturated ground could bring one crashing down without warning. Being struck by a falling trunk in this environment would be instantly fatal. Horsetails formed another towering presence. Today they are small, reed-like plants, barely noticeable along stream banks. During the Carboniferous, they grew into tree-sized forms with jointed, segmented stems, thick as a human torso. Their surfaces were abrasive, rich in silica. Brushing against them could easily tear skin or shred clothing. Ferns filled every remaining gap. Not the delicate ferns of modern gardens, but massive, coarse fronds that overlapped and interlocked. They created walls of vegetation that were nearly impossible to push through. Movement required forcing your way between stiff leaves that resisted, scraped, and cut with every step. There were no paths. The forest floor was not a ground in the conventional sense. It was a layered mat of fallen plant material in various stages of decay. Fresh leaves rested atop older layers compressed into peat-like masses. Beneath that lay waterlogged sediments and gas pockets. Weight distribution was unpredictable. What supported you one moment could collapse the next. A human attempting to move quickly would almost certainly fall. And falling here meant more than injury. It meant immersion. The water beneath the surface was thick with decaying organic matter, oxygen poor and microbe rich. It supported bacteria and fungi capable of causing severe infections. Even minor cuts would become inflamed almost immediately. Wounds would not dry. Skin would remain constantly damp, breaking down natural protective barriers. The trees themselves contributed to this chemical hostility. Many carboniferous plants produced defensive compounds to deter insects and microbial competitors. These compounds were not designed for mammals, but they were no less dangerous. Contact could cause rashes, blistering, or chemical burns. Inhalation of volatile plant emissions could irritate the respiratory tract already inflamed by oxygen overload and spores. Navigation through this forest was nearly impossible. Without branches arranged horizontally, there were few visual cues to indicate direction or scale. Trunks rose uniformly upward, creating a disorienting vertical pattern. The canopy blocked the sky entirely. Sunlight filtered down in scattered, shifting beams that changed with every breeze. Humans rely on the sun's position, shadow length, and horizon lines to orient themselves. All of those references were absent. After only a short time, direction would become meaningless. Every attempt to move toward a perceived goal would feel arbitrary. And the forest was alive with subtle motion. Leaves shifted, spores drifted, insects crawled and flew in the periphery of vision. The brain, tuned to detect predators and threats, would struggle to filter this constant movement. False alarms would trigger repeatedly. Stress hormones would flood the system, compounding fatigue and impairing judgment. Even resting was dangerous. Leaning against a tree offered no guarantee of support. Hollow trunks could collapse inward. Bark-like surfaces could crumble. Sitting on fallen debris risked sinking into unstable layers or disturbing hidden organisms. There was no safe place to stop. The sheer biomass of these forests also altered air movement. Wind barely penetrated the canopy. Heat and humidity stagnated. Exhaled carbon dioxide lingered around the body, especially when movement slowed. Breathing became heavier. The sensation of being smothered intensified. And yet, these trees were not permanent. Their rapid growth was matched by rapid death. Entire forests cycled through life and decay on timescales far shorter than modern woodlands. Fallen trees accumulated faster than they could decompose fully. This created the conditions that would eventually form vast coal deposits, locking away carbon for hundreds of millions of years. But in the present moment of the Carboniferous, this meant chaos. Trees fell unpredictably. Debris shifted without warning. The environment was in constant, slow-motion collapse. A human, used to forests as places of refuge or resources, would find no comfort here. These trees did not offer shelter from rain. Their leaves funneled water downward. They did not provide food. They produced spores, not fruit. They did not mark territory or paths. They erased them. The Carboniferous forests were not ecosystems designed for large, upright bipedal creatures. They were optimized for vertical growth, water saturation, and endless recycling of plant matter. To stand among these trees was to stand inside a system that did not recognize you as part of it. You would feel small, not in the poetic sense of awe, but in the biological sense of vulnerability. Surrounded by structures too large, too fragile, and too alien to rely on. These were trees that no longer exist because the world that supported them no longer exists, and in their shadow, a human body would not last long at all. The greatest danger in the Carboniferous forests was not always above you or around you. It was beneath your feet. The ground itself was a trap, engineered by millions of years of unchecked plant growth and perpetual decay. In this world, the earth did not offer stability. It offered collapse. Carboniferous forests grew almost exclusively in swamp environments. Rainfall was constant. Rivers overflowed regularly. Drainage was poor. Instead of firm soil, the forest floor consisted of layers of partially decomposed plant material compressed into thick mats. Beneath these mats lay water-saturated sediments, anaerobic mud, and gas pockets produced by microbial decay. What appeared to be solid ground often was not. A step that felt secure could suddenly give way. The surface layer would tear open, dropping a body into knee-deep or waist-deep sludge in an instant. Struggling would make it worse. The more you moved, the more the surrounding material would liquefy, pulling you downward. This is how natural peat bogs behave today, and Carboniferous swamps were far more extreme. Once trapped, escape would be nearly impossible without external support. There were no sturdy branches within reach. Trees were tall and straight, with trunks often too smooth or brittle to grip. Fallen debris shifted under pressure, offering no leverage. Panic would accelerate sinking. Even partial entrapment was deadly. Mud in these swamps was oxygen poor and chemically active. Hydrogen sulfide and methane seeped upward through cracks, accumulating just above the surface. Inhaling these gases causes dizziness, nausea, and rapid loss of muscle control. A person stuck waist-deep would begin to weaken within minutes. Coordination would fail. Collapse would follow. And collapse meant immersion. The water itself was not clean. It was thick with bacteria and fungi breaking down endless plant matter. Open wounds, even microscopic ones, would become infection points immediately. Eyes and airways would be exposed to contaminants. Swallowing even a small amount of water could trigger severe gastrointestinal distress or systemic infection. But even without sinking completely, simply moving across this terrain was exhausting. Every step required lifting the leg from suctioning mud. Energy expenditure skyrocketed. Heart rate increased. Breathing became more labored. Muscles fatigued quickly. In a high oxygen environment, already stressing the cardiovascular system, this level of exertion would be unsustainable. Injury was inevitable. Ankles twisted easily on unstable footing. Knees hyperextended. Muscles strained under constant uneven load. There was no way to immobilize an injury or rest it properly. Swelling would worsen rapidly in humid conditions. Pain would impair movement, increasing the risk of further falls. And predators did not need speed here. Large arthropods and amphibians were adapted to this terrain. They moved efficiently through mud and water. They sensed vibrations with extreme sensitivity. A struggling human would be detected immediately. Even curiosity from such creatures posed a lethal threat to someone already immobilized. The ground also hid vertical dangers. Tree roots formed tangled networks beneath the surface. Some created cavities large enough to swallow limbs. Others formed rigid barriers that could trap legs at awkward angles. Pulling free risked dislocation or fracture. Fractures in this environment were a death sentence. There was no dry surface to sprint a limb, no way to reduce swelling, no sterile conditions. Infection would set in quickly, shock would follow, exposure would worsen, and exposure was constant. There was no way to stay dry. Rain fell frequently, but even when it did not, condensation formed on every surface. Clothing clung to the body. Skin softened and blistered. Fungal infections would begin within hours. Every small irritation became a gateway for larger problems. The psychological impact of this terrain was severe. Humans evolved to trust the ground beneath them. Solid footing is a subconscious assumption built into how we move and think. When that assumption fails, stress skyrockets. Every step becomes a decision. Every pause invites fear. Mental exhaustion compounds physical fatigue. Decision-making degrades rapidly under these conditions. Should you move or stay still? Should you try to cross open swamp or push through dense vegetation? Should you risk stepping on debris that may collapse or detour into deeper water? There are no good choices, only varying degrees of danger. And time does not favor caution. The longer you remain in one place, the more gases accumulate around you. Carbon dioxide pools near the surface. Oxygen, despite its abundance overall, is displaced locally. Breathing becomes heavier. Headaches intensify. Nausea sets in. The ground is actively trying to suffocate you. This is why survival scenarios that imagine ancient forests as merely overgrown jungles are deeply misleading. The Carboniferous forests were not just dense, they were structurally unstable from top to bottom. They were environments in a constant state of partial collapse. Plants grew faster than the land could support them. Decay outpaced consolidation. The result was a world where nothing stayed solid for long. A human body, dependent on balance, traction, and predictable surfaces, would fail quickly here, not through dramatic violence, but through exhaustion, injury, and entrapment. You would not need to be chased or attacked. The ground alone was enough to kill you. The air of the Carboniferous forests was deceptively breathable. It did not choke. It did not burn the throat. It did not carry the immediate warning signs of danger. Instead, it offered something far more lethal, comfort that concealed toxicity. At first, breathing would feel effortless. Lungs would fill easily. Chest expansion would feel deep and satisfying. This initial sensation would be dangerously misleading. The human body evolved to associate easy breathing with safety. In this world, it was the opposite. The problem was not simply the amount of oxygen, it was how that oxygen interacted with every system in the body over time. In a 30 to 35% oxygen atmosphere, the partial pressure of oxygen in the lungs rises dramatically. Hemoglobin becomes saturated almost instantly. Tissues receive more oxygen than they are equipped to handle. Cells begin producing excessive reactive oxygen species, unstable molecules that damage cellular structures from the inside. This damage is silent at first. There is no pain receptor for oxidative stress, no alarm that signals DNA strand breaks or lipid membrane degradation. Instead, the effects accumulate invisibly, weakening systems that appear functional until they suddenly fail. The brain is particularly vulnerable. Neurons rely on finely balanced electrical signaling. Excess oxygen disrupts this balance. Neurotransmitter release becomes erratic. Inhibitory pathways weaken. Excitatory signals dominate. The result is a brain that is overstimulated but less capable of coherent thought. Concentration would suffer early. Simple tasks would feel oddly difficult. Judging distance, assessing risk, and maintaining focus would require effort. Small mistakes would become common. The environment offered no margin for error. As exposure continued, the risk of oxygen-induced neurotoxicity increased sharply. Headaches would intensify. Vision could blur or tunnel. Flashes of light might appear at the edges of perception. Muscle twitches would develop, especially in the face and hands. These are classic warning signs of central nervous system oxygen toxicity. The danger is that these signs often escalate without warning. A seizure could occur suddenly. Without prior loss of consciousness, the body would convulse violently. Muscles would contract uncontrollably. Breathing would become erratic or stop entirely. In a stable environment, medical intervention might save you. In the Carboniferous forest, a seizure meant collapse. Collapse meant impact with unstable ground, immersion in contaminated water, or both. Even if consciousness returned, the damage would be irreversible. Aspiration of water or mud into the lungs would trigger acute respiratory failure. Infection would follow. Survival beyond that point would be unlikely. But the nervous system was not the only system under attack. The lungs themselves would deteriorate steadily. Prolonged exposure to high oxygen causes inflammation of the alveoli. Fluid begins to leak into air spaces. Gas exchange efficiency drops. Breathing becomes shallow and labored, not because oxygen is absent, but because lung tissue is damaged. This condition mirrors severe chemical inhalation injury. Coughing would increase. Chest pain would develop. The sensation of air hunger would paradoxically intensify despite the oxygen-rich environment. Panic would follow, increasing breathing rate and heart workload, accelerating damage even further. The cardiovascular system would struggle to compensate. High oxygen levels cause blood vessels in the lungs to constrict, increasing pulmonary blood pressure. The right side of the heart would work harder to push blood through narrowed vessels. Over time, this strain could lead to heart rhythm disturbances or acute cardiac failure. Fatigue would deepen rapidly. Not the normal fatigue of exertion, but a systemic weakness that no amount of rest relieved. Muscles would feel heavy. Coordination would worsen. Reaction times would slow, and rest was not restorative. Sleep in a high oxygen environment is shallow and fragmented. The brain remains partially alert, unable to enter deep recovery phases. Stress hormones remain elevated. Inflammation continues unchecked. The body never truly resets. Within hours, judgment would be compromised. Risk assessment would fail. The ability to prioritize threats would degrade. The forest would feel increasingly overwhelming, not because it changed, but because perception collapsed under neurological strain. Breathing patterns would become irregular. Periods of rapid breathing would alternate with shallow pauses. Carbon dioxide levels in the blood would fluctuate, further destabilizing neural signaling. Dizziness would worsen, nausea would set in. The human respiratory system is not designed for such extremes. And then there was the chemistry of the air beyond oxygen. Carboniferous forests were biologically active environments, releasing a constant mix of gases and particles, methane from anaerobic decay, hydrogen sulfide from microbial metabolism, carbon dioxide pooling near the ground, volatile organic compounds released by plants and fungi. These substances interacted unpredictably with high oxygen. Some intensified inflammation, others displaced oxygen locally, creating pockets of hypoxia within a hyperoxic world. Stepping into such a pocket could cause sudden weakness or loss of consciousness. Inhaling hydrogen sulfide, even at low concentrations, interferes with cellular respiration. It prevents cells from using oxygen effectively, essentially causing internal suffocation. Symptoms include dizziness, confusion, and collapse. In combination with oxygen toxicity, the effects would be devastating. The air also carried spores in unimaginable quantities. Fungal spores coated the lungs, sinuses, and eyes. Immune responses triggered swelling and mucus production. Airways narrowed further. Breathing became a struggle against both inflammation and obstruction. The sensation would not be dramatic. It would be gradual, relentless, and exhausting. Every breath would require conscious effort, and consciousness itself would become unreliable. This is the cruelest aspect of the Carboniferous air. It did not kill quickly. It undermined the systems needed to recognize danger, make decisions, and escape. By the time the environment felt truly unbearable, the body would already be failing. Humans often imagine survival as a contest against external threats: predators, weather, terrain. In the Carboniferous forests, the primary threat was internal. The air turned the body against itself. Cells damaged faster than they could repair. Nerves misfired. Lungs inflamed. The heart strained. The brain lost clarity. All while breathing felt deceptively easy. This is why the air could not be trusted. It was not poison in the traditional sense. It was excess. An overload of something essential pushed beyond the narrow window that life can tolerate. The Carboniferous world did not need to suffocate you. It simply needed you to keep breathing. In the Carboniferous forests, size followed oxygen. Where modern ecosystems keep insects small through atmospheric limitation, this ancient world removed that constraint entirely. The result was a landscape dominated by arthropods that no human nervous system was prepared to confront. Insects were not side characters in this era. They were among the largest, most visible animals on land. High oxygen levels allowed insects to grow far beyond modern limits because their respiratory systems rely on passive diffusion. Oxygen entered their bodies through spiracles and traveled directly to tissues without lungs or blood. In a 30 to 35% oxygen atmosphere, diffusion became dramatically more efficient. Bodies could grow larger without suffocating themselves, and they did. The forest air was filled with movement. Wings beating, legs scraping, bodies colliding with vegetation. Even when insects were not visible, they were audible. A constant low hum vibrated through the canopy, punctuated by sudden bursts of sound as something large took flight nearby. This sensory overload would trigger immediate stress in a human brain. Large insects violate deep evolutionary expectations. Humans instinctively associate insect shapes with small size and limited threat. Scaling those same shapes up to the size of birds or dogs, breaks cognitive shortcuts that help us assess danger. The brain hesitates. Hesitation is dangerous. Many Carboniferous insects were predators. They did not hunt mammals, but they hunted anything that moved, vibrated, or emitted heat. Compound eyes detected motion with extreme sensitivity. Antennae sampled the air for chemical cues. Legs and mandibles were built for seizing, not tearing, but their strength scaled with size. A human leg brushing through vegetation would create vibrations detectable meters away. Once detected, investigation was inevitable. These insects were not aggressive in the emotional sense, but they were opportunistic. A large, warm organism struggling through mud would represent something new, something potentially edible, something worth testing. Even non-predatory insects pose severe risks. Large, herbivorous arthropods moved in numbers. They fed continuously, stripping vegetation and trampling anything in their path. Encountering a migrating group would mean being knocked off balance repeatedly. Falling into unstable ground among such creatures would be fatal. Insects also carried pathogens. Parasites, bacteria, and fungi used arthropods as vectors long before mammals evolved. A bite or puncture wound would introduce unfamiliar microbes directly into the bloodstream. The immune system would respond aggressively but blindly, triggering inflammation that could spiral into systemic failure. And bites would happen. Insect mouthparts were designed to penetrate plant tissue, fungal mats, or armored prey. Human skin would offer little resistance. Wounds would not close easily in humid conditions. Bleeding would persist. Infection would follow quickly. Pain would not always be immediate. Some arthropods injected digestive enzymes or neuroactive compounds to immobilize prey. These substances would cause numbness, weakness, or delayed pain. Reaction time would slow, coordination would worsen. Escape would become less likely. Sleep was impossible. Large insects remained active around the clock. There was no true night cycle beneath the canopy. Bioluminescent fungi and reflective eyes created constant visual noise. Rest would require stillness, but stillness made you easier to approach. Fear would accumulate rapidly. Humans are not equipped to ignore large, unfamiliar organisms moving unpredictably in close proximity. Stress hormones would surge continuously. Heart rate would remain elevated. Breathing would stay rapid and shallow. Energy reserves would drain. And then there was the sky. Above the forest floor, massive winged insects dominated the airspace. Their shadows passed overhead. Sudden gusts marked their takeoffs and landings. They collided with trunks, leaves, and sometimes each other, producing sharp cracks that echoed through the forest. Looking up offered no comfort. There were no birds to compete with them, no mammals to challenge them. The sky belonged entirely to arthropods. Humans rely on aerial safety cues. Birds often signal danger or calm. Their absence removes a critical layer of environmental awareness. Instead, every movement above would feel threatening. The scale of these insects also altered fire risk. Large winged arthropods disturbed dry plant material as they moved. Friction increased. Sparks became more likely in an oxygen-rich atmosphere. Insect-driven ignition was a real possibility, turning biological activity into environmental catastrophe. But even without fire, the psychological toll alone would be devastating. Constant proximity to large insects triggers instinctive revulsion and fear responses rooted deep in mammalian evolution. These responses are difficult to suppress even when rational thought intervenes. In a Carboniferous forest, rational thought would already be compromised. Panic would become the default state. Panic leads to poor decisions, rushing across unstable ground, swatting at insects and losing balance, hyperventilating and worsening oxygen toxicity. Each reaction feeds the next, accelerating collapse. This is why the rise of giant insects was not just a visual spectacle of the Carboniferous, it was a fundamental shift in how danger manifested on land. The forest was alive with movement at every scale, and much of that movement was armored, sharp, and curious. Humans did not evolve alongside insects like this. We evolved in a world where insects were small, where their threat was limited, where a single bite rarely decided survival. In the Carboniferous forests, insects were not background noise, they were dominant life. And surrounded by them, watched by them, brushed by them, bitten by them, a human would begin to understand something deeply unsettling. This world was not merely hostile, it was already occupied. Among all the creatures that ruled the Carboniferous skies, none embodied the terror of that world more completely than Meganura. It was not a dragonfly in the modern sense. It was something older, heavier, and far more dominant. With wingspans reaching up to 70 centimeters, it moved through the air like a living blade, precise, silent, and relentless. To understand why Meganura would be a serious threat to a human, you must strip away modern assumptions about insects. Today, dragonflies are delicate. They hunt mosquitoes. They avoid contact with large animals. Meganura lived under entirely different rules. High oxygen allowed flight muscles to generate immense power. Wings beat slower than modern insects, but with far greater force. Every movement displaced large volumes of air. When Meganura took off, the sound was not a buzz. It was a deep, cracking rush, like a heavy object slicing through space. Its compound eyes were enormous, wrapping around much of its head. These eyes were optimized for motion detection, capable of tracking multiple targets simultaneously. In the dense, low-light conditions beneath the forest canopy, Meganura did not rely on color or detail. It relied on movement, and humans move constantly. Breathing, shifting weight, brushing against leaves, every action produced motion signals that Meganura could detect instantly. From dozens of meters away, it would know something large and unfamiliar was below. Investigation was inevitable. Meganura was a predator. It hunted other insects, amphibians, and anything else it could overpower. Its mandibles were designed to seize and crush, not to chew slowly, but to immobilize prey mid-flight. Scaled to its size, those mandibles could easily break human skin, crush fingers, or tear muscle tissue. A single strike would not kill a human outright. That made it more dangerous. Meganura did not need to kill immediately. A defensive strike to the face, neck, or arm would cause deep lacerations. Blood loss would begin instantly. Pain would be intense. Balance would be compromised. In a swamp environment, that was often enough. And Meganura did not hunt alone. The skies were crowded with large flying insects. Territorial boundaries existed, but movement attracted attention. One disturbance could draw multiple predators, each responding not to strategy, but to opportunity. Looking up would not help. The canopy filtered light unevenly, creating flickering patterns that confused depth perception. Wings blended into shadow and glare. Meganura could approach from above, below, or behind with little warning. Its flight was fast, controlled, and adaptable to tight spaces. Modern humans rely heavily on peripheral vision to detect aerial threats. In this environment, peripheral vision was constantly overwhelmed by drifting leaves, spores, and smaller insects. Distinguishing real danger from background noise became nearly impossible. Fear responses would misfire. The moment a large shadow crossed overhead, adrenaline would spike, heart rate would surge, muscles would tense, breathing would accelerate, worsening oxygen toxicity and cognitive impairment. Attempting to flee would almost certainly lead to a fall, and falling meant vulnerability. Meganura was not a scavenger. It targeted movement. A human struggling to stand, slipping in mud, or crawling to regain footing would be irresistible. Wings could fold and maneuver close to the ground. Strikes could be repeated. Even if Meganura did not persist, the damage was done. Open wounds in this environment were catastrophic. Humid air prevented clotting. Fungal spores and bacteria invaded instantly. Swelling and inflammation followed. Infection spread rapidly through damaged tissue. There was also the risk of eye injury. Large flying insects collided with vegetation constantly. Their wings were tough but not indestructible. Fragments of plant matter, dust, and debris were frequently knocked loose. A fast-moving insect passing close to the face could drive debris into the eyes with enough force to cause corneal damage or blindness. Temporary blindness in the Carboniferous forest was effectively permanent. Navigation required visual cues. Avoiding hazards required sight. Without it, every step became a gamble. The psychological impact of Meganura's presence was just as damaging as physical injury. Humans evolved to scan the skies for birds of prey, but birds follow predictable patterns. They perch, they glide, they signal their presence through calls. Meganura did none of these things. It appeared and vanished silently, unpredictably, without warning or sound. This unpredictability eroded any sense of control. Constant vigilance became necessary, but vigilance could not be sustained. The brain fatigued, attention drifted. The moment focus slipped was the moment danger struck. Even attempting to remain still was not a solution. Carboniferous insects were curious. Unfamiliar objects were investigated. A motionless human body would still emit heat, carbon dioxide, and chemical signals. Meganura did not need movement to detect you forever, only long enough. And stillness created new risks. Remaining in one place increased exposure to gas pockets, insects crawling over the body, and fungal spore inhalation. Discomfort escalated. The urge to move returned. There was no winning strategy. Above all, Meganura represented something deeply unsettling to the human mind. It was a reminder that intelligence is not required for dominance. Speed, sensory acuity, and environmental advantage are enough. In the Carboniferous skies, Meganura was optimized perfectly. Its reign ended not because it failed, but because the world changed. Oxygen levels fell, flight efficiency dropped, size became a liability, evolution moved on. But in its time, Meganura was unmatched. For a human, encountering it would shatter any remaining illusion of safety. The sky was not empty. It was occupied, patrolled, claimed, and every glance upward would carry the same realization. You were not the apex observer here. You were the anomaly beneath a sky that hunted. If the sky belonged to Meganura, the forest floor belonged to something far worse. Arthropleura was not fast. It did not need to be. It was massive, armored, and perfectly adapted to a world where the ground itself was unstable and hostile to anything that walked upright. Arthropleura resembled a millipede, but comparing it to modern relatives only minimizes the threat. Some species reached lengths of over 2.5 meters, with bodies composed of dozens of overlapping armored segments. Each segment was rigid, heavy, and edged with sharp margins. Its legs moved in coordinated waves, allowing it to glide across mud, leaf litter, and shallow water with disturbing efficiency. This creature did not chase prey. It did not need to. Arthropleura lived in the same layered ground that humans could barely cross. It sensed vibrations through the substrate. Every footstep, every stumble, every shift of weight sent signals through the swamp floor. To Arthropleura, a human was not a stranger. It was a disturbance, and disturbances were investigated. While Arthropleura is often described as a herbivore or detritivore, that classification does not imply harmlessness. Large modern herbivores can kill accidentally or defensively, and Arthropleura was far less constrained by social behavior or avoidance instincts. It responded to contact and vibration with force. Its body was a moving wall. If it encountered a human in dense undergrowth, there would be no room to evade. The forest floor was narrow, tangled, and enclosed. Arthropleura could push through vegetation that humans struggled to part. Its armored segments deflected branches and debris. Its mass collapsed unstable ground beneath it, creating trenches of churned mud in its wake. Being knocked over by Arthropleura would be catastrophic. The force of its movement alone could break bones. Ribs, legs, or arms caught beneath its body would be crushed under hundreds of kilograms of armored mass. Even a glancing impact could knock a human into deeper mud or water, and once down, getting back up was unlikely. Arthropleura's legs ended in hardened points adapted for traction in soft ground. Contact with human skin would cause deep puncture wounds and lacerations. These injuries would bleed heavily and refuse to close. Infection would begin immediately. There was also the risk of entrapment. Arthropleura often moved along established paths through vegetation, compressing the ground beneath it. If a human slipped into one of these troughs, the surrounding mud could collapse inward. Struggling would worsen the situation. Arthropleura did not need to attack directly for this to become fatal. Its sheer presence altered the terrain. Arthropleura also represented a psychological breaking point. Humans are not equipped to process threats that large and unfamiliar emerging at ground level. The instinctive response is to flee. In the Carboniferous forest, fleeing blindly was often worse than standing still. Panic increased movement, movement increased vibration. Vibration drew attention. Stress hormones surged. Breathing accelerated. Oxygen toxicity intensified. Coordination degraded further. Decision-making collapsed. The creature's size also destroyed any illusion of human dominance. There was no tool, no improvised weapon, no intimidation strategy that would work. Its armor was thick. Its nervous system was decentralized. Injury would not stop it quickly. Provoking it would only increase danger. Even avoidance was difficult. Arthropleura blended into the forest floor surprisingly well. Its segmented body mimicked foreign plant material and layered debris. In low-light conditions, distinguishing it from the environment was challenging until it moved. By then, distance was already closing. The sound it produced was subtle but terrifying. A low, rhythmic scraping as dozens of legs moved in sequence. A vibration felt more than heard. Once noticed, it triggered immediate dread. The brain recognized scale, before understanding form. This was not something you could step over. Arthropleura dominated the Carboniferous forest floor because it was perfectly adapted to a world where size and armor mattered more than speed or intelligence. Predators avoided it. Smaller animals yielded to it. The terrain itself bent under its passage. Humans, dependent on balance, agility, and open space, had none of those advantages here. And unlike Meganura, which might strike and leave, Arthropleura lingered. It moved slowly, persistently, reshaping the ground as it went. Once it entered an area, the environment became even more unstable than before. This created a feedback loop of danger. Unstable ground caused falls. Falls caused vibration. Vibration attracted Arthropleura. Arthropleura caused further collapse. There was no scenario where a human presence improved survival odds. Even if direct contact was avoided, the fear alone would be exhausting. Muscles remained tense. Senses stayed hyper-alert. Fatigue deepened. Mistakes multiplied. The Carboniferous forest was not divided neatly into safe zones and dangerous zones. Danger moved, danger crawled. Danger reshaped the landscape beneath you. Arthropleura was not a monster in the cinematic sense. It did not stalk, it did not hunt for sport. It simply existed at a scale and density that made human survival impossible. To share the forest floor with it was to accept one unavoidable truth. This world was built for giants that did not need to notice you to destroy you. One of the most disorienting aspects of the Carboniferous forests was not what lived there, but what did not. There were no birds overhead, no mammals darting through undergrowth, no familiar shapes, sounds, or behaviors to anchor human perception. The absence itself became a threat. Humans evolved in ecosystems filled with other mammals. Even when those mammals were predators, their presence followed patterns we understand instinctively. Movement in the bushes means something specific. Calls and warning signals mean something specific. In the Carboniferous forests, those signals did not exist. Instead, the land was dominated by insects, amphibians, and plants. Life forms that followed rules alien to mammalian instincts. This absence of familiar animals stripped away a critical layer of environmental awareness. In modern forests, birds act as early warning systems. Sudden silence signals danger, alarm calls ripple through the canopy. Mammals freeze or flee in response to predators, providing cues even when threats are unseen. Without birds or mammals, there were no such cues. Danger did not announce itself. Everything felt quiet in the wrong way. Sounds existed, but they lacked meaning. Insect activity produced constant noise, but it carried no directional or contextual information humans could interpret reliably. A rustle could mean nothing or everything. A vibration could be background movement or an approaching threat. This forced the brain into a state of permanent uncertainty. Uncertainty is exhausting. The human mind constantly builds predictive models of its environment. These models rely on patterns learned over a lifetime and inherited through evolution. In the Carboniferous forests, those models failed completely. The brain could not predict outcomes based on past experience. Every decision required conscious effort. Should you move or stay still? Should you approach a sound or avoid it? Should you push through vegetation or detour around it? Without familiar reference points, choices felt arbitrary. Wrong choices carried immediate consequences. This cognitive overload rapidly degraded mental performance. Reaction times slowed. Attention fragmented. The ability to plan even a few steps ahead diminished. The environment demanded constant vigilance, but the brain could not sustain it. Fear responses became erratic. Sometimes panic surged without cause. Sometimes real danger failed to trigger urgency. This mismatch between threat and response increased risk at every turn. Hesitation in the wrong moment could mean falling, sinking, or being noticed by something larger. Sleep deprivation accelerated the collapse. Without mammals or birds, there were no clear circadian cues beneath the canopy, no dawn chorus, no evening quiet. Light levels shifted subtly but unpredictably. The body struggled to regulate sleep cycles already disrupted by oxygen, toxicity, and stress hormones. Rest became shallow and fragmented, if it happened at all. A fatigued brain is a vulnerable brain. Hallucinations could begin to appear. Shadows seemed to move independently. Peripheral vision played tricks. The distinction between imagination and reality blurred. This is a known effect of prolonged stress, isolation, and environmental overload. In the Carboniferous forest, hallucinations were not harmless. Reacting to imagined threats wasted energy and increased movement. Ignoring real threats became more likely. The margin for error disappeared. There was also the profound sense of being alone, in a way modern humans rarely experience. Not solitude, but alienation. Nothing in the forest acknowledged you as a fellow animal. Insects did not react with caution. Amphibians did not flee in familiar ways. Plants did not provide shelter or food. The environment did not respond predictably to your presence. This eroded psychological resilience. Humans rely on subtle feedback from their surroundings to maintain a sense of control. Even hostile environments usually follow rules we can learn quickly. The Carboniferous forests did not. Every system that normally supports human intuition was missing. This absence also removed hope. In survival scenarios, hope often comes from spotting familiar life. A bird suggests water. Mammal tracks suggest paths. Edible plants suggest sustenance. Here, none of those cues existed. The forest offered no signs that survival was possible. Hopelessness is not abstract. It manifests physically. Motivation drops. Posture slumps. Movement slows. Attention narrows. These changes further reduce survival odds. The lack of mammals also meant no competition that could distract predators or large arthropods. Humans were not hidden among a crowd of similar-sized animals. They stood alone as large, slow, upright anomalies. This made detection more likely, not less. Even if no immediate attack occurred, the constant sense of being out of place took its toll. Stress hormones remained elevated. Immune function weakened. Inflammation increased. Minor infections escalated. The human body began to shut down non-essential systems to conserve energy. Digestion slowed. Thermoregulation faltered. Cognitive clarity faded. This is why the absence of familiar animals was not a neutral detail. It was an amplifier of every other danger. It removed context, cues, and comfort all at once. The Carboniferous forests were not just physically hostile, they were psychologically incompatible with the human mind. You were not merely unadapted here, you were unrecognized. And in a world where nothing understands you, survival becomes a matter of time, not skill. While plants built the towering structure of the Carboniferous forests, fungi controlled what happened when those plants fell. They were not a background process, quietly recycling nutrients. They were giants in their own right, shaping the environment in ways that made human survival even more unlikely. The sheer amount of plant growth in the Carboniferous created an enormous problem for the planet. Dead material accumulated faster than it could decompose through normal bacterial processes alone. Fungi evolved to fill that gap, and they did so aggressively. Fungal networks spread through soil, water, and rotting wood, forming vast underground systems that connected entire forests. Above ground, some fungi grew into massive structures, thick and fibrous, breaking down fallen trunks from the inside out. Decay was not slow or subtle. It was constant, active, and chemically intense. This created an atmosphere saturated with spores. Every disturbance released clouds of microscopic particles into the air. A footstep, a falling branch, a shift in temperature. Spores filled the lungs with every breath. In modern environments, the immune system can usually handle limited exposure. Here, the volume was overwhelming. The respiratory system would be the first to fail. Fungal spores lodged deep in the airways, triggering inflammation almost immediately. Mucus production increased, air passages narrowed, coughing intensified, breathing became painful and inefficient. Combined with oxygen toxicity, this inflammation would accelerate lung damage rapidly, and the danger did not stop at irritation. Many Carboniferous fungi produce toxins to defend their territory from insects and competing microbes. These compounds were not designed for mammals, but they interacted unpredictably with human physiology. Inhalation could cause headaches, dizziness, nausea, and neurological disturbances. Skin contact could lead to rashes, blistering, or chemical burns. The forest floor was effectively coated in biological irritants. Open wounds became lethal liabilities. Fungal spores readily colonized damaged tissue. Cuts that might be minor in modern conditions would become infected within hours. Inflammation would spread beyond the wound site. Fever would rise. Without rest, hydration, or medical care, the immune system would quickly be overwhelmed, and rest was not possible. The smell of decay was constant, though not always recognizable as rot, sweet, acrid, sulfurous undertones mixed with damp plant odors. This constant sensory input caused nausea and loss of appetite. Eating, already impossible due to lack of familiar food, became even less appealing. The forest also released invisible threats. As fungi broke down organic matter, they consumed oxygen locally and released carbon dioxide and other gases. These gases pooled near the ground, especially in still air beneath the canopy. Stepping into one of these low-lying pockets could cause sudden weakness, confusion, or collapse. The danger was silent and invisible. A human might feel dizzy, assume it was exhaustion, and take a step forward only to lose consciousness moments later. Falling face down in contaminated mud or shallow water would be fatal. Fungal dominance also destabilized the terrain further. As roots and wood were hollowed out from within, structures that looked solid became fragile. Tree trunks collapsed without warning. Ground layers gave way suddenly. The forest was in a constant state of internal collapse driven by unseen decay. This unpredictability eroded confidence. Every surface became suspect. Leaning against a trunk, stepping on fallen debris, even standing still carried risk. Anxiety remained high. Muscles stayed tense. Fatigue deepened. The psychological impact of fungal presence was profound. Humans are conditioned to associate visible mold and decay with danger, but on a small scale. Here, decay was the dominant process of the entire ecosystem. Everything was breaking down all the time. Nothing felt clean. Nothing felt safe. This created a sense of contamination that never lifted. Skin felt constantly dirty and irritated. Eyes burned. Throat felt raw. Every breath carried the awareness that the environment itself was hostile at a microscopic level. The immune system, already strained by stress, injury, and oxygen imbalance, would begin to fail. Minor infections would spread. Inflammation would become systemic. Fever and confusion would set in. Coordination would worsen. Decision-making would degrade further. Fungi did not need to attack directly. They simply existed everywhere, exploiting every weakness, every injury, every breath. Their success was not based on speed or strength, but on inevitability. The Carboniferous forests were not just places where life grew, they were places where life was constantly being dismantled and recycled. For the planet, this process eventually shaped the future, locking carbon away and changing atmospheric composition. For a human trapped inside it, the same process was a death sentence. You would not see the fungi that ended you. You would inhale them, absorb them, and slowly be overcome by them. In this world, decay was not the end of life. It was the dominant form of life itself. Light in the Carboniferous forests did not behave the way the human brain expects it to. There was no open sky above, no clear transition between day and night, no reliable rhythm of brightness and shadow. Instead, the world existed in a permanent state of filtered gloom, where darkness was not an event but a condition. The forest canopy was extraordinarily dense. Layers of towering lycopsids, horsetails, and massive fern fronds stacked vertically, intercepting sunlight long before it reached the ground. What little light made it through arrived in broken shafts, scattered and constantly shifting as plants moved subtly in humid air. To a human eye, this environment would feel unnaturally dim even at midday. Vision would struggle almost immediately. The human visual system relies on contrast, edges, and depth cues to interpret space. In the Carboniferous forest, those cues were degraded. Everything existed in overlapping shades of green, brown, and shadow. Objects blended into one another. Distance became difficult to judge. Missteps increased. A route that appeared close might be farther away. A depression in the ground might look shallow, but drop suddenly. The brain, unable to trust visual input, hesitated constantly. Movement slowed. Uncertainty grew, and slowing down carried its own dangers. In low light, peripheral vision becomes less reliable. The rods in the human retina handle dim conditions, but sacrifice detail and color. Motion is detected, but its source is unclear. This created a constant sense of something moving just out of sight. That sensation triggers a powerful stress response. Humans evolved to be cautious in darkness. Predators historically hunt under low light. The brain associates dim environments with vulnerability. Cortisol levels rise. Adrenaline remains elevated. The body prepares for threats that may or may not exist. In the Carboniferous forest, this state never resolved. There was no bright daylight to reset the nervous system, no clear night to signal rest. The body remained trapped in a prolonged alert state, burning energy without recovery. Fatigue deepened rapidly. Navigation became nearly impossible. Without the sun visible overhead, orientation failed. The shadows did not point consistently in one direction. The canopy broke light into fragments that shifted unpredictably. Moving in a straight line was almost impossible without landmarks, and landmarks were indistinguishable from one another. Every trunk looked the same. Every cluster of ferns repeated endlessly. The forest erased memory of where you had been. This disorientation had severe psychological consequences. Humans rely on spatial memory to feel in control of their environment. When that memory fails, anxiety spikes. Panic becomes more likely. The urge to move faster or change direction randomly increases, leading to greater risk of injury or entrapment. Darkness also amplified the threat of insects and arthropods. Large insects blended seamlessly into shadow. Their shapes broke up against the cluttered background. A creature could be meters away and remain invisible until it moved. By then, reaction time was minimal. Compound eyes reflected faint light, producing brief glints that vanished as quickly as they appeared. The brain struggled to interpret these flashes. Were they threats or reflections? Real or imagined? False alarms became common. Jumping at shadows wasted energy. Swatting at nothing caused loss of balance. Hyperventilation worsened oxygen toxicity. Every misinterpretation compounded physiological stress. The forest floor was especially dangerous in low light. Unstable ground required constant visual monitoring. Mud, roots, and decaying plant layers needed to be assessed with each step in dim conditions. This assessment was unreliable. Slips and falls increased dramatically. Even a minor fall could result in immersion in contaminated water or gas pockets. Darkness also concealed vertical hazards. Dead trunks leaned at unstable angles. Branches hung low or snapped without warning. Fungal weakened structures collapsed silently, without clear light. Detecting these hazards in time was unlikely. The human brain also relies on changing light patterns to track time. In the Carboniferous forest, time dissolved. Minutes felt like hours. Hours felt endless. Without sunrise or sunset cues, the circadian rhythm drifted. Sleep pressure built but could not resolve. Exhaustion became chronic. This led to microsleeps. Brief lapses in consciousness, lasting seconds, could occur without warning. During a microsleep, posture collapses. Awareness disappears in a dangerous environment. This is often fatal. A momentary loss of awareness could mean stepping into deep mud, leaning into a collapsing trunk, failing to notice an approaching arthropod. Darkness also intensified isolation. Humans are social creatures. We derive comfort from seeing others, even animals, moving through the same space in low light. That visual connection disappears. Even if other life was nearby, it remained unseen. The forest felt empty and oppressive at the same time. This contradiction strained the mind. Hallucinations became more likely. Under stress, sleep deprivation, and sensory deprivation, the brain begins to fill gaps with imagined stimuli. Shapes seemed to move when they did not. Sounds took on meaning they did not have. The boundary between perception and imagination blurred. Reacting to hallucinations increased danger. Ignoring real threats became easier. Trust in one's senses eroded. Once trust in perception is lost, survival becomes almost impossible. Humans depend on rapid sensory integration to make decisions. When sight cannot be trusted, the brain leans on hearing and touch. But in the Carboniferous forest, those senses were also unreliable. Humidity muffled sound. Dense vegetation absorbed noise. Vibrations traveled unpredictably through layered ground. Touch revealed only wetness, decay, and instability. There was no stable reference point left. darkness also favored organisms adapted to it. Amphibians, arthropods, and fungi did not rely on vision the way humans do. They sensed vibration, chemical cues, and moisture. Reduced light did not hinder them, it hindered you. This imbalance made every encounter asymmetrical. They detected you long before you detected them. Attempts to create light would fail. Fire was too dangerous. In an oxygen-rich environment, sparks could ignite uncontrollable blazes. Bioluminescent fungi existed, but provided no useful illumination. There was no safe way to alter the lighting conditions. You were trapped in the dark. The Carboniferous forest was not a place where darkness came and went. It was a place where darkness lingered permanently, shaping behavior, physiology, and psychology. Humans did not evolve to live in such environments for extended periods. Our ancestors relied on open skies, visible horizons, and predictable light cycles. Remove those, and the nervous system begins to unravel. In this forest, darkness was not dramatic or sudden. It was constant, and constant darkness does not terrify through shock. It terrifies through erosion. Bit by bit, it stripped away awareness, confidence, and control. By the time you realized how lost you were, the forest had already claimed you. The Carboniferous forests did not need predators or physical traps to kill you. Sometimes, all it took was the invisible chemistry of the air itself. Pockets of deadly gases formed quietly at ground level, turning ordinary movement into a gamble with unconsciousness and death. This danger existed because the Carboniferous world was saturated with decay. Plants grew faster than they could be fully broken down. Fallen trunks, leaves, and roots accumulated in thick layers. Beneath the surface, oxygen was quickly consumed by bacteria and fungi as they decomposed this material. Once oxygen was depleted, anaerobic processes took over, producing gases that modern humans rarely encounter in open-air environments. Carbon dioxide was the most common. Heavier than oxygen, carbon dioxide pooled close to the ground, especially in still air beneath the dense canopy. These pools were not dramatic clouds or visible fogs. They were thin layers, sometimes only tens of centimeters thick, spreading silently across low-lying areas. A standing human might not notice anything unusual at first, but kneel, stumble, or sink slightly into the soft ground, and your head could enter one of these pockets. The effects would be immediate. Carbon dioxide does not poison the body in the traditional sense. Instead, it interferes with the brain's ability to regulate breathing. Rising levels in the blood trigger panic, air hunger, and confusion. Muscles weaken, coordination fails, consciousness fades rapidly. A person exposed to high carbon dioxide does not have time to think clearly. There is no gradual warning. One moment, you feel lightheaded. The next, your legs give way. Collapse follows. And collapse in the Carboniferous forest almost always meant immersion. Face down in mud, partially submerged in stagnant water, surrounded by decomposing plant matter that continued to release gas. Even if the initial exposure did not render you fully unconscious, weakness would prevent effective escape. Attempting to stand would be like trying to move underwater. Every motion felt delayed. Balance was impossible. Carbon dioxide was not the only threat. Hydrogen sulfide was also common. Produced by anaerobic bacteria breaking down sulfur-containing compounds. Hydrogen sulfide is extremely toxic even at low concentrations. It interferes with cellular respiration, preventing cells from using oxygen efficiently. The result is internal suffocation. Even in an oxygen-rich environment, Hydrogen sulfide has a distinctive rotten egg smell at low levels, but at higher concentrations it numbs the sense of smell entirely. This made it especially dangerous. A person might notice a faint odor and then, moments later, nothing at all. That absence of smell would feel like relief. It was not. Exposure would cause dizziness, nausea, and sudden collapse. Muscles would fail. Breathing would slow or stop. The brain would lose consciousness before understanding what was happening. And unlike carbon dioxide, hydrogen sulfide can kill within minutes. Methane also accumulated in the soil and water. While methane is not directly toxic, it displaces oxygen in confined pockets. It reduced breathable air suddenly. A step into such a pocket could cause a brief loss of consciousness, enough to fall into water or mud. These gases did not stay in one place. They shifted with temperature, pressure, and movement. A falling tree, a disturbance in the ground. Even your own footsteps could release trapped gas from beneath decaying layers. The environment was unstable at a chemical level. This made prediction impossible. One step forward might be safe. The next could drop you into a suffocating zone. There was no visual cue to distinguish danger from safety. No smell you could rely on. No sound that warned you in advance. Humans are poorly equipped to deal with invisible threats. Our survival instincts are tuned to movement, sound, and sight. Gas undermines all of those systems. By the time your body reacted, it was already too late to respond effectively. The danger was amplified by posture. Carboniferous forests forced humans into frequent crouching, bending, and climbing. Pushing through dense vegetation required lowering the head. Navigating unstable ground required watching your feet. Resting meant sitting or kneeling. All of these positions brought the face closer to ground level, exactly where gases concentrated. Even sleeping was deadly. Lying down placed the nose and mouth directly within gas layers. Loss of consciousness during sleep would lead to silent suffocation. There would be no struggle, no awakening, just a gradual shutdown of the brain. Attempting to avoid low areas was not a solution. The entire forest existed at low elevation, saturated with water. Even slightly raised ground was unstable and temporary. Gas pockets formed everywhere, organic matter decayed, which was everywhere. Wind might disperse gases briefly, but wind rarely penetrated the canopy. Air movement was minimal. Gases lingered. The physiological effects of gas exposure also compounded other failures.
Carbon dioxide increased panic and hyperventilation, worsening oxygen toxicity and exhausting muscles faster. Hydrogen sulfide disrupted cellular energy production, amplifying weakness and confusion.
Methane induced sudden hypoxia, increasing the risk of falls. These effects overlapped unpredictably. A person already fatigued, dehydrated, and cognitively impaired would not recognize symptoms correctly. Dizziness might be blamed on exhaustion, nausea on hunger, confusion on stress. By the time the real cause was understood, the body would be unable to respond. Gas exposure also made rescue impossible. Even if another human were present, approaching someone collapsed in a gas pocket would expose the rescuer to the same danger. Multiple fatalities would occur quickly, as has happened in modern industrial accidents involving confined spaces. In the Carboniferous forest, the entire ground layer functioned like a massive confined space. This threat existed at all times. It did not sleep, it did not hunt, it did not announce itself. It simply waited for gravity, fatigue, or curiosity to bring you closer. The most terrifying aspect of these suffocation zones is that they required no mistake beyond existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. You could be cautious, you could move slowly, you could avoid obvious hazards, and still step into invisible death. This reality eroded confidence completely. Every movement carried uncertainty. Every decision felt risky. Stress levels remained extreme. The nervous system stayed locked in fight or flight, accelerating physical decline. The Carboniferous forests were often imagined as lush and life-giving. In truth, they were chemically hostile landscapes where the byproducts of life accumulated faster than they could be dispersed. Life created the conditions for its own lethality. Plants fed fungi. Fungi fed bacteria. Bacteria produced gas. Gas killed anything that could not sense or tolerate it. Arthropods and amphibians were adapted to this environment. They stayed low. They moved slowly. They tolerated brief hypoxia. Humans could do none of these things effectively. We depend on clean, well-mixed air. Remove that assumption, and the body fails rapidly. This is why survival would not be a matter of avoiding predators or finding shelter. It would be a matter of avoiding an invisible threat that you could not see, smell, or hear until it was already overwhelming you. The Carboniferous forest did not need to chase you. Sometimes it simply waited for you to bend down. Rain in the Carboniferous forests was not a weather event. It was a permanent condition. Moisture saturated every layer of the environment, from the air you breathed to the ground beneath your feet. There was no dry season, no clear break, no moment when the forest paused to recover. For a human body, this constant wetness would become a slow, inescapable killer. Equatorial regions during the Carboniferous experienced relentless rainfall driven by warm oceans and intense evaporation. Clouds formed quickly and released water frequently. Even when rain was not actively falling, humidity remained near saturation. Water condensed on leaves, trunks, and skin continuously. You would never be dry. Clothing would soak within minutes and remain heavy and clinging. Evaporation, the body's primary cooling mechanism, would barely function. Sweat would form but not evaporate, trapping heat against the skin. Core body temperature would begin to rise even without exertion. This condition mirrors severe heat stress. Fatigue would increase rapidly. Heart rate would remain elevated. Breathing would become heavier. Muscles would tire quickly. Combined with oxygen toxicity, this created a dangerous physiological loop where the body overheated while simultaneously struggling to regulate oxygen levels. Hydration would become a paradox. Water was everywhere, yet safe drinking water was nowhere. Surface water was stagnant, filled with decaying organic matter, bacteria, fungi, and parasites. Drinking it would introduce pathogens the human immune system had never encountered. Severe gastrointestinal illness would follow quickly. Vomiting and diarrhea would accelerate dehydration rather than prevent it. Refusing to drink was no solution. Constant sweating, even inefficient sweating, depleted fluids rapidly. The humid air masked thirst signals. By the time dehydration was recognized, physical performance would already be compromised. Dizziness, weakness, and confusion would worsen. Rain also transformed the terrain continuously. Paths did not exist long enough to be memorized. What seemed passable 1 hour could flood the next. Shallow water became deep suddenly. Mud liquefied, debris shifted and floated. The forest floor changed shape constantly. This instability increased the risk of entrapment. Water filled depressions and masked depth. Stepping into what looked like a shallow pool could drop you into waist-deep sludge. Attempting to pull free would exhaust muscles rapidly. Panic would increase sinking. Flooding also released gases trapped beneath decaying layers. Carbon dioxide and hydrogen sulfide bubbled upward as water displaced them. Rain turned stable ground into chemical traps, expanding suffocation zones unpredictably. Areas that were safe minutes earlier could become lethal without warning. The skin suffered relentlessly. Constant moisture broke down the protective outer layer. Maceration softened tissue, making it more vulnerable to cuts, abrasions, and infections. Fungal growth would begin quickly between toes, in folds of skin and under clothing. Itching, pain, and inflammation followed. Open sores would develop. Every step through abrasive vegetation created micro-injuries. In dry environments, these heal quickly. Here, they remained open, inflamed, and colonized by microbes. Infection spread easily through compromised tissue. This process alone could become fatal. Systemic infection leads to fever, confusion, and organ stress. In an environment where rest was impossible and hydration unreliable, the body would not recover. Rain also erased sound cues. Falling water masked movement. The constant patter on leaves and trunks created white noise that overwhelmed hearing. Approaching arthropods became harder to detect. Splashes from amphibians blended into the background. Danger arrived silently. Vision suffered as well. Water-coated leaves and trunks, reflecting light unpredictably. Glare and shadow alternated rapidly. Depth perception worsened. Water droplets clung to eyelashes and brows, blurring sight further. Wiping the face provided only momentary relief. Rain also weighed down vegetation. Branches sagged lower. Leaves collapsed inward. Pathways narrowed further. Pushing through required more force, increasing fatigue and risk of injury. Falling branches became more common as water stressed weakened plant structures. And then there was hypothermia. Even in warm environments, prolonged exposure to water causes heat loss. Wet clothing draws heat away from the body. Wind, when it occasionally penetrated the canopy, accelerated cooling. The body struggled to maintain temperature despite high ambient warmth. This mismatch confused physiological responses. Shivering could occur even while overheating. Energy reserves drained faster. Coordination suffered. Judgment declined. Sleep became impossible. There was no dry place to lie down. Sitting meant soaking. Lying down meant immersion. Any attempt at rest exposed the body to further heat, loss, gas exposure, and insect contact. Exhaustion accumulated without relief. The psychological toll was immense. Humans associate rain with temporary discomfort. Here, discomfort never ended. Morale collapsed. Irritation became constant. Frustration turned into despair. Mental resilience eroded. And despair is dangerous. It reduces motivation to move carefully. It encourages risky decisions. It narrows focus. All of these increase the likelihood of falls, injuries, and exposure to gas pockets. Rain also amplified the threat of disease. Pathogens spread easily in wet environments. Insects thrived, fungal spores multiplied, bacteria flourished. The immune system, already strained by stress and oxygen imbalance, began to fail. Small illnesses escalated quickly. Fever weakened the body further. Dehydration worsened. Confusion increased. The ability to recognize danger declined. The Carboniferous forests did not offer shelter from rain. Trees did not form protective canopies the way modern forests do. Their structures funneled water downward. Standing beneath them often meant enduring concentrated streams of runoff. There was no safe refuge. Even caves or elevated areas were dangerous. Water pooled in depressions, displacing breathable air. Gases accumulated, collapse risk increased. Seeking shelter often led directly into suffocation zones. This is why rain was not merely unpleasant, it was a force multiplier. It worsened every other threat simultaneously. Unstable ground became more unstable. Gas exposure increased. Infections accelerated. Fatigue deepened. Perception degraded. The environment did not allow adaptation. Humans can endure rain when they can dry off, rest, and recover. The Carboniferous forests denied all three. Moisture was constant. Rest was unsafe. Recovery was impossible. Every hour spent in this wetness pushed the body closer to systemic failure. Muscles weakened. Immune defenses collapsed. Cognition deteriorated. Morale vanished. And all the while, the rain kept falling. Not dramatically, not violently, just endlessly. In this world, water was not life-giving. It was suffocating, and under its weight, even the strongest human body would eventually give way. Fire in the Carboniferous forests was not a rare catastrophe. It was an ever-present possibility, waiting for the smallest trigger. The same oxygen-rich atmosphere that fueled gigantic life also turned the landscape into a loaded weapon. One spark was enough to transform the forest from suffocating wetness into unstoppable flame. At oxygen levels above 30%, combustion behaves differently. Materials that resist burning today ignite easily. Flames spread faster. Heat output increases dramatically. Even damp plant matter can burn under the right conditions. In the Carboniferous forests, this meant that fire did not need drought or prolonged dryness to begin. Lightning was common. Warm, moisture-laden air rose constantly, forming massive storm systems. Lightning strikes were frequent and powerful. When they hit tall lycopsids or dense fern layers, ignition could occur instantly. Fire did not creep slowly along the ground. It exploded upward, racing through the canopy in seconds. Humans would have no warning. There were no distant sirens of crackling flames, no visible smoke columns, until the fire was already close. Dense vegetation blocked sight lines. Sound was muffled by rain and foliage. By the time heat was felt, escape routes were already compromised. Movement through the forest during a fire was nearly impossible. Vegetation that normally resisted passage became fuel. Flames leapt from trunk to trunk, leaf to leaf. Burning debris rained downward. Embers fell into mud and water, continuing to smolder. Oxygen-rich air fed the blaze relentlessly. Smoke in this environment was especially deadly. High oxygen combustion produces large quantities of toxic gases. Carbon monoxide levels rose quickly. Particulate matter filled the air. Breathing became painful and disorienting almost immediately. Vision dropped to near zero. Inhaling smoke in a 35% oxygen atmosphere accelerated lung damage rapidly. Oxygen toxicity combined with smoke inhalation to destroy respiratory tissue. A few breaths could cause irreversible injury. Panic would follow instantly. Humans instinctively flee fire, but the Carboniferous forest offered no clear paths. Turning back meant retracing unstable ground. Moving forward meant pushing into unfamiliar terrain, already filled with smoke and flame. Every direction looked equally dangerous. Running increased oxygen intake, worsening toxicity, and smoke exposure. Coordination failed. Stumbling became likely. Falling in a burning forest was fatal. Even water did not guarantee safety. Fires could burn across swamp surfaces by igniting floating plant matter and gases released from beneath the water. Methane pockets ignited explosively. Steam formed rapidly, scalding skin and lungs. Shallow pools became traps rather than refuges. Fire also destabilized the forest structurally. Trees, weakened by decay, collapsed as flames consumed their internal supports. Trunks fell unpredictably, blocking roots or crushing anything beneath them. Burning vegetation created showers of sparks that ignited new areas ahead of the main fire front. Escape routes vanished faster than they could be chosen. The psychological impact of fire in this environment was overwhelming. Humans rely on visibility and distance to assess fire behavior. In the Carboniferous forest, sight lines were short and distorted. Flames appeared suddenly from multiple directions. Smoke reduced orientation further. The brain struggled to form a coherent escape plan. Decision-making collapsed. Stress hormones spiked. Tunnel vision set in. Fine motor control vanished. Movements became erratic. The risk of injury skyrocketed, and fire did not always announce itself loudly. Smoldering combustion occurred beneath the surface as peat-like layers burned slowly underground. Ground that appeared safe could suddenly collapse into burning cavities. Stepping into one would result in severe burns and entrapment. Even after flames passed, danger remained. Oxygen-rich embers continued to burn intensely. Toxic gases lingered. The forest floor remained unstable. Breathing stayed hazardous. Survival did not improve once the fire front moved on. The Carboniferous world experienced frequent fires precisely because of its abundance. Plants produced enormous amounts of biomass. That biomass dried unevenly between rains. Oxygen fed ignition. Fire became a natural regulator, periodically resetting forests that grew too dense. Arthropods and amphibians adapted to this cycle. They sheltered in burrows, water, or underground cavities. Humans had no such options. Climbing trees was impossible. Hiding underground risked suffocation. Remaining in open areas exposed the body to flames and smoke. There was no safe response. Fire also interacted with other threats synergistically. Burning released additional carbon dioxide and toxic gases, expanding suffocation zones. Smoke irritated already inflamed lungs. Heat worsened dehydration. Panic increased movement, attracting arthropods and increasing the risk of falls. Everything failed at once. The idea of surviving by finding a clear patch or firebreak did not apply. Carboniferous forests lacked large open spaces. Even river channels were choked with vegetation. Fire jumped easily across narrow water bodies in oxygen-rich air. Once ignition occurred nearby, survival odds dropped to near zero. Humans often imagine fire as a dramatic climax to a survival story. In the Carboniferous forest, it would be abrupt and final. There would be no heroic escape, no last-minute refuge. Only heat, smoke, confusion, and collapse. Firestorms did not discriminate. They did not target the weak or the slow. They consumed everything in their path equally. And in a world already hostile to human physiology, fire was the ultimate reminder that this planet was operating under different rules. The Carboniferous forests were built to burn, and when they did, there was nowhere for a human to go. Even if you avoided the obvious dangers of the Carboniferous forests, even if you were never struck by a falling tree, never bitten by a giant insect, never trapped by mud or gas, your body would still be fighting an enemy it could not see and could not understand. Disease in this world was not an occasional risk, it was an inevitability. The Carboniferous period existed long before mammals evolved robust immune systems. Microbes ruled quietly and efficiently. Bacteria, fungi, protozoa, and parasites filled every ecological niche, many of them interacting with plants and arthropods in ways that modern humans have never encountered. Your immune system would be completely unprepared. Immunity is not universal. It is shaped by evolutionary exposure. The human immune system recognizes patterns common to pathogens we and our ancestors have faced for millions of years. Carboniferous microbes did not share that history. Many would bypass early immune detection entirely, spreading before the body even realized something was wrong. Exposure would begin immediately. Every breath drew spores and bacterial fragments deep into the lungs. Every step splashed contaminated water onto skin. Every minor scratch opened a pathway directly into the bloodstream. Ingestion was almost unavoidable as droplets entered the mouth and nose. Within hours, the immune response would escalate. White blood cells would flood infected tissues, triggering inflammation. Fever would rise as the body attempted to slow microbial replication. Energy reserves would be diverted from muscles and cognition toward immune defense. This shift alone would be debilitating. Fever increases metabolic demand while simultaneously reducing physical performance. Muscles weaken, reaction times slow, dehydration accelerates. In a humid environment where thermoregulation already struggled, fever pushed the body toward collapse. But fever was only the beginning. Many ancient microbes relied on strategies unfamiliar to modern medicine. Some produced neurotoxins that interfered with nerve signaling. Others targeted blood chemistry, disrupting oxygen transport or clotting mechanisms. Some invaded muscle tissue directly, breaking it down from within. Symptoms would not follow familiar patterns. There would be no clear timeline, no predictable progression. Pain might appear before fever, or paralysis before discomfort. Confusion could arrive suddenly, without warning. The brain, already stressed by oxygen toxicity and sleep deprivation, would struggle to compensate. Parasites added another layer of threat. Carboniferous waters and soils contained organisms adapted to using arthropods and amphibians as hosts. A human body would be a novel but suitable environment. Parasites did not need to recognize you as prey. They only needed access. Larvae could enter through skin, others through ingestion or inhalation. Once inside, they would migrate, feeding on tissue or blood. Immune responses would be intense but often misdirected, damaging the body as much as the invader. Swelling, pain, and organ stress would escalate rapidly. Infection also compromised judgment. Systemic illness alters cognition. Attention narrows. Irritability increases. Risk assessment fails. A sick person makes worse decisions, moves less carefully, and reacts more slowly to danger. This created a vicious cycle. Illness increased the likelihood of injury. Injury increased exposure to microbes. Exposure worsened illness. Within a day, the body could enter sepsis. Sepsis occurs when the immune system's response to infection becomes uncontrolled, damaging organs and disrupting blood pressure. Symptoms include rapid heartbeat, confusion, shortness of breath, and loss of consciousness. Without medical intervention, sepsis is often fatal. In the Carboniferous forest, sepsis would progress unchecked. There was no way to rest properly, no way to regulate temperature, no way to maintain hydration safely. The body fought on multiple fronts simultaneously and lost ground on all of them. Even minor illnesses became lethal because recovery was impossible. The immune system requires energy, nutrients, and rest to function effectively. Hunger weakened defenses. Dehydration impaired circulation. Stress hormones suppressed immune activity. Sleep deprivation prevented repair. The environment stripped away every support system the body relied on. There was also the issue of inflammation overload. Oxygen toxicity, fungal spores, chemical irritants, and infection all triggered inflammatory responses. When too many inflammatory pathways activate at once, they interfere with each other. Swelling becomes systemic. Blood vessels leak fluid. Tissues starve of oxygen despite its abundance. This paradox defined the Carboniferous experience. There was oxygen everywhere, yet cells suffocated. There was water everywhere, yet dehydration progressed. There was life everywhere, yet survival was impossible. The skin, the body's first line of defense, broke down rapidly. Constant moisture softened it. Abrasions multiplied. Fungal growth compromised its barrier function. Once skin integrity failed, infection accelerated exponentially. Lymph nodes swelled. Pain increased. Movement slowed further. Pain itself became a problem. Chronic pain exhausts the nervous system. It disrupts sleep. It narrows attention. It increases stress hormones in survival situations. Pain reduces the ability to respond quickly and effectively. The Carboniferous forest offered no analgesia. No plants provided relief. No rest reduced discomfort. Pain accumulated hour by hour, wearing down mental resilience. Mental resilience mattered as much as physical strength. As illness progressed, despair deepened. Motivation declined. The will to move carefully or remain vigilant weakened. This psychological collapse often preceded physical collapse. Humans survive harsh environments not only through physiology, but through belief that survival is possible. The Carboniferous forest provided no such belief. Nothing improved with time. Nothing became familiar or manageable. Illness made that truth undeniable. Fever blurred perception. Chills alternated with overheating. Thoughts became disorganized. Memory faltered. Hallucinations became more likely. Distinguishing real threats from imagined ones became increasingly difficult. At this stage, even avoiding danger became impossible. The body might stumble into gas pockets, fail to notice approaching arthropods, collapse into unstable ground. Illness did not need to kill directly. It only needed to weaken the body enough for the environment to finish the job. This is why disease is often overlooked in imagined prehistoric survival scenarios. People pictured teeth and claws, not microbes. But throughout human history, disease has killed more people than predators ever have in the Carboniferous forest. That imbalance would be even more extreme. Predators might injure you. Disease would dismantle you, and it would do so quietly, invisibly, relentlessly. The Carboniferous world was not sterile or primitive at the microbial level. It was rich, aggressive, and highly efficient. Microbes had millions of years to adapt to that environment. Humans had none. Your immune system would fight bravely. It would fail anyway. By the time you realized you were sick, survival would already be mathematically impossible. The forest would not need to attack you. Your own body overwhelmed by an ancient biological arms race it was never meant to enter, would begin to shut itself down. And in that silence between breaths, disease would claim what the environment had already doomed. Beyond the physical dangers of the Carboniferous forests, there was a slower and more insidious threat that ensured failure even in the absence of injury or disease. The human mind itself was not equipped to endure this world. Time, perception, and identity began to fracture under constant stress, isolation, and sensory overload. Humans rely on structure to remain psychologically stable. Day and night create rhythm. Familiar animals create context. Predictable cause and effect create a sense of control. The Carboniferous forests stripped all of that away simultaneously. Nothing followed patterns the brain could recognize or learn quickly. As a result, cognition began to unravel. Time was the first casualty. Without clear daylight cycles beneath the canopy, the brain lost its primary temporal anchor. Light levels shifted subtly but inconsistently. There was no sunrise to signal beginning, no sunset to mark rest. Minutes stretched unpredictably. Hours blurred together. The internal clock drifted. This temporal disorientation had profound consequences. Decision-making relies on an accurate sense of time. Judging how long to rest, how far to move, or when to change strategy requires a stable timeline. Without it, choices became impulsive or paralyzing. Hesitation increased. Mistakes multiplied. Sleep deprivation accelerated the collapse. Even when exhaustion became overwhelming, true sleep was impossible. Fear prevented deep rest. Insects crawled over the body, moisture-soaked clothing and skin. The brain remained partially alert, scanning for danger. Sleep occurred in brief fragments, lasting seconds or minutes at most. These microsleeps were dangerous. During a microsleep, posture slackened, awareness vanished. A person could stumble, lean into unstable debris, or fail to notice an approaching threat. Waking occurred abruptly, often accompanied by confusion and panic. Panic further destabilized cognition. Stress hormones flooded the system continuously. Cortisol and adrenaline remained elevated without resolution. This impaired memory formation, emotional regulation, and impulse control. Small frustrations triggered outsized reactions. Fear became generalized rather than targeted. Everything felt threatening. This state eroded rational thought. Humans under chronic stress revert to instinctive behaviors. These instincts evolved for short-term threats, not constant exposure. Fight or flight responses activated repeatedly with no opportunity to reset. Eventually, the nervous system began to fail. Symptoms of acute stress reaction appeared. Tremors, rapid heartbeat, shallow breathing, narrowed vision, auditory distortion. These symptoms reduced situational awareness instead of enhancing it. The environment became harder to interpret precisely when precision mattered most. Isolation worsened the effect. Humans are social organisms. Even the presence of animals provides psychological grounding. In the Carboniferous forest, there were no familiar faces, no communicative sounds, no behaviors that mirrored human emotion or intention. The mind received no social feedback. This absence created a sense of derealization. The world began to feel unreal, like a dream or hallucination. Objects lost meaning. Threats felt abstract until they were immediate. Motivation declined. Emotional detachment set in as a protective response. Detachment is dangerous. It reduces urgency. It dulls fear. It encourages risk-taking or resignation. Survival requires engagement. Detachment undermines it. Hallucinations became increasingly likely. Under prolonged stress, sleep deprivation, and sensory deprivation, the brain begins to generate stimuli internally. Shadows appeared to move independently. Sounds formed patterns that were not there. The sense of being watched intensified. Reacting to hallucinations wasted energy and increased movement. Ignoring real threats became easier. Trust in perception eroded completely. Once perception could not be trusted, navigation and avoidance became impossible. Even memory began to fail. Short-term memory degraded under stress. Remembering where you had just stepped, which areas felt safer, or which paths were already tested, became difficult. The forest felt endlessly new and endlessly dangerous at the same time. This created a loop of helplessness. Every attempt to adapt failed. Every lesson learned felt unreliable. The brain stopped trying to form long-term strategies and focused only on immediate discomfort. Long-term thinking vanished. Without the ability to imagine survival beyond the next few moments, hope collapsed. And hope is not abstract optimism. It is a biological driver of persistence. When hope fades, effort declines. Movement slowed. Vigilance dropped. Posture slumped. These physical changes fed back into mental decline. Slouched posture reduced lung expansion. Shallow breathing worsened oxygen imbalance. Fatigue deepened. Clarity faded further. Even pain perception changed. Chronic stress alters how the brain processes pain. Sometimes pain intensified, becoming unbearable. Other times it dulled, allowing injuries to go unnoticed until they became severe. Both outcomes increased danger. The sense of self also began to fragment. Humans define themselves through continuity. Memories of past and plans for future create identity. In the Carboniferous forest, the future shrank to minutes. The past lost relevance. Identity collapsed into raw sensation. This psychological breakdown did not require days. It could begin within hours. By the time physical threats demanded complex responses, the mind was no longer capable of providing them. Reaction speed slowed, and creativity vanished. Emotional regulation failed. At this stage, survival instincts did not sharpen, they misfired. Running when stillness was safer, freezing when movement was required, focusing on minor discomforts while ignoring major threats. The environment did not forgive these errors. This is why the Carboniferous forests were not just biologically incompatible with humans, they were cognitively incompatible. The human brain evolved in environments that rewarded pattern recognition, social cooperation, and gradual learning. The Carboniferous forest offered none of those rewards. It punished exploration. It punished curiosity. It punished persistence. Mental collapse ensured physical collapse. Even if the body remained intact, the mind would not. And without the mind coordinating movement, decision-making, and awareness, survival was no longer a meaningful concept. You would still be alive, but you would no longer be capable of staying that way. By the time a full day passed in the Carboniferous forests, survival would no longer be a theoretical question. It would be a biological impossibility. Not because of one single catastrophic event, but because the human body would fail in a predictable, cascading sequence. Hour by hour, system by system, the environment would dismantle you. The first hour would feel deceptively manageable. Adrenaline would mask discomfort. Heightened alertness would sharpen the senses temporarily. Movement would feel awkward but possible. Breathing would seem easy, even pleasant, due to the oxygen-rich air. The brain would still believe adaptation was possible. This optimism would not last. Within the second hour, physiological stress would begin to surface. Heart rate would remain elevated even at rest. Breathing would become faster and less efficient. Subtle dizziness would appear as oxygen toxicity began affecting neural signaling. Coordination would degrade slightly, just enough to increase the risk of missteps. Humidity would start to weigh on the body. Sweat would soak clothing without cooling effect. Heat would build internally. Muscles would fatigue earlier than expected. Thirst signals would appear, but drinking safely would already be impossible. The first dehydration deficit would begin forming. By the third hour, cognitive performance would noticeably decline. Decision-making slowed. Reaction time increased. Attention drifted. The forest would feel increasingly overwhelming as the brain struggled to filter sensory input. Insects, shadows, and sounds blended together into a constant background of threat. Small injuries would accumulate. Abrasions from vegetation, insect bites, strained muscles from unstable footing. None of these would seem serious individually. Together, they created multiple entry points for infection and inflammation. Oxygen toxicity effects would intensify. Headaches would become persistent. Pressure behind the eyes increased. Visual disturbances might appear briefly. The nervous system would be overstimulated but less precise. Balance would suffer further. By the fourth hour, exhaustion would begin to dominate. Not the normal tiredness of exertion, but systemic fatigue driven by metabolic stress. Muscles would feel heavy. Posture would slump. The effort required to lift feet from mud would increase noticeably. Mistakes would multiply. A foot would sink deeper than expected. A grip would slip on wet vegetation. A stumble would nearly become a fall. Recovery would take longer each time. The immune system would already be reacting. Exposure to spores and microbes triggered inflammation. Sinuses swelled. The throat felt raw. Coughing increased. Breathing became more labored despite oxygen abundance. By the fifth hour, heat stress and dehydration would intersect dangerously. Heart rate spiked with minimal movement. Dizziness became more frequent. Nausea might appear. Mental clarity continued to erode. The urge to rest would grow stronger. Resting was not restorative. Sitting or stopping increased exposure to insects, gas pockets, and moisture. Muscles stiffened quickly. Standing again required more effort than before. Every pause came with a cost. By the sixth hour, psychological strain became severe. Hope diminished. Frustration turned to despair. The mind struggled to form coherent plans beyond immediate discomfort. The forest no longer felt navigable. It felt endless and hostile. Sleep pressure built but could not resolve. Microsleeps might occur. Brief lapses in awareness lasting seconds. During these moments, posture slackened. Balance failed. Awareness disappeared. Waking brought confusion and panic. A fall at this stage was likely. Falling meant immersion. Immersion meant infection, risk, gas exposure, or entrapment. Even if you stood again, the energy cost would be enormous. By the seventh hour, coordination would be significantly impaired. Fine motor control degraded. Hands trembled slightly. Walking required constant attention. Reaction time slowed enough that avoiding sudden hazards became unreliable. Vision worsened in the dim environment. Depth perception failed. Obstacles appeared closer or farther than they were. Misjudgments increased. Stress hormones remained elevated, further impairing cognition. By the 8th hour, illness symptoms could emerge. Low-grade fever, chills alternating with overheating, muscle aches unrelated to exertion. These signs indicated the immune system was under heavy load. Fever worsened dehydration. Dehydration worsened cardiovascular strain. Strain worsened fatigue. By the 9th hour, breathing would feel distinctly uncomfortable. Lungs inflamed from spores, oxygen toxicity, and humidity. Coughing became frequent. Chest tightness increased. Inhalation felt shallow. Panic responses intensified. Panic worsened everything. Hyperventilation increased oxygen toxicity, rapid movement increased fatigue and injury risk. Poor decisions became more frequent. By the 10th hour, the body's compensatory mechanisms began to fail. Blood pressure regulation became unstable. Standing might cause lightheadedness. Brief blackouts became possible. Muscles weakened further. A collapse at this stage was often unrecoverable. Standing again required strength and coordination that no longer existed. Lying down increased gas exposure risk. Water seeped into clothing and skin. Heat loss accelerated. By the 11th hour, cognitive fragmentation intensified. Thoughts became disorganized. Memory failed. The sequence of events blurred. Distinguishing safe from unsafe areas became impossible. Hallucinations might begin at the edges of perception. Responding to hallucinations wasted energy. Ignoring real threats became easier. Awareness narrowed dangerously. By the 12th hour, the body entered a crisis state. Multiple systems were failing simultaneously. Dehydration reduced blood volume, oxygen toxicity damaged neural and lung tissue, infection spread, inflammation became systemic, heat regulation collapsed. Even without a single dramatic event, survival odds dropped precipitously. Movement slowed to a crawl. Every step required deliberate effort. Stopping felt necessary but unsafe. Continuing felt impossible. By the 13th hour, exposure effects dominated. Skin breakdown caused pain with every movement. Fungal growth irritated sensitive areas. Insect bites became inflamed. Wounds refused to close. Pain drained mental resources. By the 14th hour, gas exposure risk increased dramatically. Fatigue forced more crouching, sitting, and leaning. These postures brought the face closer to ground-level gas pockets. Dizziness episodes became more frequent. One misstep into a carbon dioxide or hydrogen sulfide pocket could cause collapse within seconds. By the 15th hour, sepsis risk became real. Systemic infection could trigger confusion, rapid heart rate, and shortness of breath. Decision-making would degrade further. Awareness of surroundings diminished. By the 16th hour, survival was no longer about endurance. It was about luck. Avoiding a fall, avoiding a gas pocket, avoiding ignition, avoiding collapse. Luck was not a strategy. By the 17th hour, the body began shutting down non-essential functions. Digestion halted. Immune regulation faltered. Muscles weakened further. The brain conserved energy by reducing higher cognitive processing. Instinct dominated, but instincts were mismatched to the environment. By the 18th hour, consciousness itself became unreliable. Periods of confusion alternated with brief clarity. Awareness flickered. The environment felt unreal. Movement became hesitant and erratic. A stumble at this stage was likely fatal. By the 19th hour, collapse was imminent. Whether from dehydration, infection, oxygen toxicity, gas exposure, or injury, the body no longer maintained internal stability. Vital signs drifted beyond recoverable ranges. By the 20th hour, survival depended on an outcome that no longer existed. There was no recovery window, no safe rest, no adaptation curve, no turning point where conditions improved. The remaining hours did not need to happen. The human body was not designed to function under continuous, overlapping stress without relief. The Carboniferous forest provided no relief at any level. By the time a full day ended, death was no longer a sudden event. It was the final stage of a process that began the moment you took your first breath in that ancient air. This is why the phrase "you would not survive a day" is not hyperbole. It is a conservative estimate. The Carboniferous forest did not need to kill you quickly. It only needed to remain exactly as it was, and it always did. The Carboniferous forests did not last forever. Their collapse was not sudden, and it was not caused by a single catastrophe. It was the result of the same forces that made them so dominant in the first place. Excess eventually undermined itself, and the world that produced giants slowly dismantled them. For millions of years, Carboniferous plants removed carbon dioxide from the atmosphere at an unprecedented rate. Photosynthesis locked carbon into massive amounts of plant biomass. When those plants died, much of that carbon was buried rather than fully decomposed. Layers of peat accumulated, compressed by sediment and time, eventually forming the coal deposits humans would mine hundreds of millions of years later. This process altered the atmosphere fundamentally. As carbon dioxide levels fell, global temperatures began to shift, the greenhouse effect weakened, climates became less uniformly warm and humid, seasonal variation increased, rainfall patterns changed. The endless swamp forests lost the stability they depended on. Oxygen levels also began to fall. The same burial of plant matter that once raised oxygen concentrations eventually reduced them. Less active decomposition meant less oxygen release. Fires became less frequent. Insects lost their size advantage. Diffusion-based respiration no longer supported gigantic bodies. This atmospheric rebalancing reshaped life on land. Giant insects declined first. Without extremely high oxygen, large arthropods could not sustain flight or efficient metabolism. Meganura and its kin disappeared. Arthropleura vanished as size became a liability rather than an advantage. The forests themselves fragmented. Lycopsids and giant horsetails were specialists. They thrived in waterlogged, stable conditions. As climates became drier and more variable, these plants struggled to reproduce and compete. Seed-bearing plants began to rise, better adapted to fluctuating environments. The dominance of spores gave way to the dominance of seeds. This transition was slow but irreversible. With fewer dense swamp forests, the landscape opened, soils stabilized, gas pockets diminished, light reached the ground more consistently. Ecosystems began to resemble something closer to the modern world. This transformation laid the groundwork for future life. Amphibians, once dominant in wet environments, began to give way to early reptiles. Reptiles were better adapted to drier conditions, able to reproduce away from water and regulate moisture internally. This shift marked the beginning of a new ecological era. The Carboniferous collapse was not an extinction in the dramatic sense. It was a reorganization. Life did not vanish. It adapted to a new balance. But the giants were gone. The excess that once fueled dominance became unsustainable under changing conditions. From a planetary perspective, this was a correction. The Carboniferous forests had pushed atmospheric chemistry to an extreme. Oxygen levels rose beyond long-term stability. Fire frequency increased. Ecosystems became fragile despite their abundance. The planet responded by shifting conditions until equilibrium returned. This lesson is critical. Earth does not reward excess indefinitely. Systems that grow too dominant eventually alter their own foundations. When those foundations shift, collapse follows. For humans, the legacy of the Carboniferous is paradoxical. We benefit enormously from it. Coal powered the Industrial Revolution. It fueled early electricity, transportation, and manufacturing. Entire civilizations rose on the buried remains of those ancient forests. The carbon locked away during the Carboniferous delayed climate warming for millions of years. And yet, those same forests were utterly incompatible with human survival. They created a world where abundance became lethality, where life flourished at scales that excluded us entirely. This contrast highlights an uncomfortable truth. Human dominance depends on a narrow range of environmental conditions. Slight shifts in oxygen, temperature, humidity, or ecosystem structure can push the world beyond our tolerance quickly. The Carboniferous forests demonstrate that Earth has existed in states where humans would not just struggle, but fail completely. Not because we are weak, but because we are specialized. We are adapted to balance. We require moderate oxygen, predictable seasons, stable ground, clean air, microbial familiarity. Remove enough of these at once, and survival becomes impossible, regardless of intelligence or effort. The collapse of the Carboniferous world also reminds us that planetary change does not require intention. Plants did not aim to alter the atmosphere. Fungi did not plan to bury carbon. Insects did not choose gigantism. Each organism simply exploited available conditions. The result was a world pushed to an extreme. Extremes are unstable. This pattern repeats throughout Earth's history. Periods of dominance give way to correction. Abundance gives way to balance. Life persists, but in new forms. Humans often imagine themselves outside this cycle. We are not. Our technologies create atmospheric changes. Our industries alter carbon cycles. Our activities push ecosystems toward thresholds. The Carboniferous stands as a warning written deep in geological time. A planet can feel stable right up until it is not. For a human standing in a Carboniferous forest, this future collapse would be irrelevant. There would be no comfort in knowing that oxygen levels would one day fall, or that forests would thin. Survival was not a matter of waiting out the storm. The environment was lethal now. But understanding how and why that environment ended reveals something essential about Earth itself. The planet does not optimize for comfort. It optimizes for continuity. Life adapts. Conditions shift. Dominant systems rise and fall. What seems permanent is temporary on geological timescales. The Carboniferous forests once covered vast portions of the globe. They shaped the atmosphere, the climate, and the future of life. And then they disappeared, leaving behind compressed shadows of themselves beneath the ground. Humans would later burn those shadows for energy, unaware of the world that produced them. If anything, this era teaches humility. Earth has worn many faces. Some were hospitable, some were deadly. None were designed for us. The Carboniferous was a world of excess, where life pushed boundaries until the boundaries pushed back. It was magnificent, alien, and unforgiving. And its collapse was not a failure. It was a transition. The end of that forest age made room for reptiles, dinosaurs, mammals, and eventually humans. Without it, our world would not exist. But without our world, the Carboniferous thrived. That is the final irony. The same planet can support worlds where humans dominate and worlds where humans cannot exist at all. The Carboniferous forests were proof that Earth does not belong to any one form of life. It belongs to change, and in the long history of that change, human survival is a brief, conditional chapter, not a guarantee. The giants fell, not because they were weak, but because the world moved on. And if the planet has taught us anything, it is this. It always does. The Carboniferous forests are gone, but they did not vanish without leaving a message. It is written in stone, in coal seams, in atmospheric records locked inside ancient minerals. It is a message about limits, about balance, and about how easily a thriving world can become uninhabitable for certain forms of life. The first lesson is that habitability is not a universal condition. Earth has been alive for over 4 billion years, yet only a fraction of that time has supported conditions suitable for humans. Most of the planet's history would have been lethal to us. Too hot, too cold, too toxic, too unstable. The Carboniferous forests sit squarely in that category. Life flourished, but not life like us. This challenges a deeply rooted human assumption. We tend to view Earth as naturally welcoming, as if the planet exists in a default state meant for human occupation. The Carboniferous proves the opposite. Habitability is temporary, fragile, and highly specific. Small shifts in atmospheric chemistry, temperature, or biological dominance can render the planet hostile without warning. The second lesson is that abundance can be dangerous. The Carboniferous forests did not collapse because life failed. They collapsed because life succeeded too well. Plants expanded unchecked. Oxygen levels climbed beyond long-term stability. Ecosystems grew dense and brittle. Fire became inevitable. Atmospheric balance tipped. This is a recurring pattern in Earth's history. Whenever one process dominates too strongly, feedback mechanisms emerge to correct it. Sometimes those corrections are gentle. Sometimes they are catastrophic. But correction always comes. Balance is not a moral concept. It is a physical requirement. The Carboniferous world violated that requirement for millions of years, and the consequences were written into the planet itself. Oxygen declined, climates shifted, dominant life forms disappeared. New ones took their place. Humans are not exempt from this pattern. We extract carbon that was buried to restore balance long ago. We alter atmospheric chemistry rapidly. We reshape ecosystems faster than evolution can adapt. The Carboniferous reminds us that the planet does not negotiate, it responds. The third lesson is that intelligence does not guarantee survival. Arthropods ruled the Carboniferous without complex cognition. Plants reshaped the atmosphere without awareness. Fungi engineered entire landscapes through chemistry alone. None of these organisms planned their dominance, yet they achieved it completely. Humans often believe intelligence places us above environmental constraints. It does not. Intelligence allows us to understand constraints, but it does not remove them. The Carboniferous forests were lethal not because they were hostile by intent, but because their operating parameters fell outside human tolerance. No amount of cleverness could change oxygen toxicity. No strategy could make unstable ground solid. No knowledge could make ancient microbes harmless. Adaptation requires time and generations. Humans arriving suddenly into that world would have none. The fourth lesson is about specialization. Humans are extraordinarily specialized organisms. We are optimized for endurance, walking on firm ground, for visual navigation in open spaces, for social cooperation, and for problem-solving within stable environments. These traits made us dominant in the world we evolved in. They would have killed us in the Carboniferous. Upright posture becomes a liability in unstable swamps. Reliance on vision fails in permanent gloom. Social intelligence offers no advantage in isolation. Problem-solving collapses when the environment offers no safe experiments. This is not a weakness. It is the cost of specialization. Every successful species trades flexibility for efficiency. The Carboniferous forests simply existed outside the narrow range where our efficiency matters. The fifth lesson is about time. Humans think in days, years, and lifetimes. The Carboniferous unfolded over tens of millions of years. Atmospheric changes that seem extreme to us were slow in geological terms. Ecosystems adapted gradually until they reached a breaking point. This scale mismatch often leads to misunderstanding. We expect warning signs that make sense on human timelines. The planet does not operate on those timelines. By the time change becomes obvious to organisms dependent on stability, adaptation may no longer be possible. In the Carboniferous, there was no single moment where life realized the system was unsustainable. There was only gradual accumulation until correction became unavoidable. The same principle applies today. The sixth lesson is humility. The Carboniferous forests were not primitive. They were sophisticated, complex, and globally influential ecosystems. They shaped atmospheric chemistry, climate systems, and the future trajectory of life on Earth. Yet they are gone. Dominance does not equal permanence. Humans often measure success by control, by expansion, by growth. The Carboniferous shows that growth without balance leads to collapse, not victory. Control is temporary. The planet always reasserts itself. The final lesson is perspective. It is tempting to view the Carboniferous as a nightmare world, a hostile alien planet. In reality, it was neither good nor evil. It was simply Earth in a different state, governed by the same physical laws that operate today. From the perspective of a giant insect, it was paradise. From the perspective of a human, it was uninhabitable. This duality is essential to understanding Earth and our place on it. There is no single ideal version of the planet. There are only versions that favor certain forms of life over others. Humanity exists because current conditions favor us. That favor is conditional. The Carboniferous forests remind us that Earth does not exist to support humans. Humans exist because Earth happens, for now, to support us. If conditions shift beyond our tolerance, intelligence will not save us. Technology may delay consequences, but it cannot override fundamental planetary processes indefinitely. This is why the question, "You would not survive a day in the Carboniferous forests," is not just about the past. It is about understanding limits. It is about recognizing that survival is not guaranteed by dominance, confidence, or belief in progress. It is guaranteed only by alignment between biology and environment. The Carboniferous forests were aligned for plants, fungi, insects, and amphibians. They were misaligned for humans in every possible way. and that misalignment was absolute. The forest did not hate you. It did not resist you. It simply operated according to rules that made your existence impossible. In that sense, it offers the clearest warning Earth can give. The planet does not need to destroy life to end human survival. It only needs to change, slightly, slowly. Inevitably, the Carboniferous forests were a world where life thrived beyond our capacity to exist within it. They remind us that the Earth's history is not a straight line leading to us, but a branching tree of possibilities, many of which exclude us entirely. Our era feels permanent because we are living inside it. The Carboniferous once felt permanent too. It was not, and neither is ours.